It was an unbearably hot day, the sun beating down without mercy on the small party that made their way through the deserts of dawn. Though some of the procession was born and raised in the arid southern deserts of West Eos, the same could not be said for two of their number, who instead had traveled from the northernmost and coldest of the kingdoms. The two men had divested themselves of most of their clothes along the way, instead only wearing thin tunics and breeches that were still drenched in sweat. The party was a curious one to say the least, comprised of only two men, one woman holding a newborn babe, and a cart. There were no guards or servants, only four tired and weak travelers that waited with bated breath for their destination to finally be seen over the sand dunes. This party had come together a month ago. Before that, there were 5 more northerners that had accompanied their kin south, only to perish in a skirmish outside the Tower of Joy where the woman and babe had joined them. It had not been a good month for Ned Stark. He had traveled south to find and save his sister, and all except one of his brothers at arms had died in the attempt. Despite succeeding in finally bringing the guards blocking the path to his sister down, Ned had not found any joy there either, as he arrived just in time to exchange a few words with his beloved sister before she also died, leaving him with a new nephew he knew nothing about and a wet nurse. He had cried his eyes out for hours, holding on to the bloody body and begging his Lyanna to come back, praying to all the gods he knew to just give her breath again, until Howland Reed, the last of those to accompany him south, had dragged him away and helped him dry his eyes. Then had come the fury. An anger that had lived in Ned since he had seen the bodies of those small children in the Red Keep while the new king that he had helped to put on the throne laughed at the sight of blood and brains. Children that could easily have been his newfound nephew. It had been put aside while they rode through the Rocky Mountains of Dawn, desperate to save the last victim of war, but now confronted with more blood and death, the anger came back with a revenge and burned through his veins. It was all for nothing. All because one man, their new king, couldn't keep it in his pants and had drove away the only woman Ned cared about. They had arrived at Starfall 3 days after the death of Lyanna, bringing back to House Dane the body of their son and his sword. Ned had been the one to kill Arthur Dane himself, as he was one of the 3 that had barred the northerner entrance to the tower and to his sister, and yet the Danes only had sad smiles and understanding eyes as he stood gloomily in the shadows, thoughts delving deeper and deeper into the quiet rage that had taken him over. The party stayed there for 2 weeks as the Danes argued that the babe was too young to travel through the deserts and arranged to have the Silent Sisters come and embalm the body of his dear sister so that he could take her home to the north, where she belonged. For these 2 weeks, Ned planned in silence and solitude, gratefully taking over one of the studies as his solo when Lord Ulrich Dane offered. First he sent a letter to the new King Robert. He didn't want to speak to his former foster brother, but Lyanna was his betrothed and so he needed to know. Still, all Ned wrote was a curt "she's dead." Ned unsealed it with his signet ring before moving on to other matters. He would need to get himself a new ring, he had reminded himself, as the one he wore was only meant for a minor member of House Stark. The Lord's signet ring had burned along with his father, and the heirs had disappeared with his brother's body. Probably fed to the dogs of the Red Keep. But plans were made and Ned barely came out of his temporary study, often skipping meals and avoiding anyone other than Howland as he wrote pages upon pages of lists, things to do, things he would need, people who would assist, estimation of costs. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. That was his reasoning and that was what led his small party to the desert. To Sunspear. The first sight they had of the palace was the golden domes that topped each tower glinting under the bright desert sun. Smiles cracked the party's faces for the first time in days and their pace picked up, eager to reach the shade and comfort that the great castle offered. They rode for many more hours, barely exchanging a word as they sped through the dunes until the sun was low on the horizon and they finally reached the great gates of the city, where they found a small retinue of men awaiting them. Lord Stark. The man in front greeted from atop his sand steed. I am Endre Illyrian, steward to House Martell. Follow me and we will get your party refreshed before meeting with the prince. It was an order that Ned, for one, was happy to comply with. They waited for a moment as the Dornishman and his retinue turned before following behind as they led the way through the streets of the city. The palace was on top of a great hill, and as they made their way through the streets various inhabitants could be seen attending to their businesses. The sight of so many scantily clad people would have once made Ned blush in embarrassment and horror. But after 2 weeks of genuinely considering riding through the desert fully nude, he knew better. The people here seemed acclimated to the heat, all of them being darker of skin than any northerner could ever dream to be, but the sun was relentless and any dress that exposed the skin to whatever slight breeze there might be was a boon. Ned definitely wouldn't turn down any clothes he was offered, no matter how revealing they may be. Finally, they arrived at the top of the hill and the receiving party dismounted, handing their horses to the stable boys that came to greet them. The travelers did the same and followed their guides through the gates, into the wonderful shade of the palace and through the hallways until they arrived at a corridor that was empty except for servants. "This is the guest wing," Steward Andre explained. "In this corridor you will find your quarters while you stay here. The servants have already drawn up your baths and set out clothes and refreshments, and one will be waiting for you, Lord Stark, to take you to Prince Doran's solar." With a final nod, the steward and his guards left the servants to direct each member of the party to their respective rooms, and Ned was comforted to know that the wet nurse and his nephew John were in the room next to his. The room was quite large and airy, beautifully furnished and colored, but more importantly to Ned, the windows were open and letting in a cool breeze, making the sheer silk curtains blow softly as it entered the room. Ned wasted no time in divesting himself of his clothes and making his way into the side room where his bath awaited, the cool water refreshing him even further. In the north, the baths were boiling hot to counteract the cold of the air. Ned found it comforting to know that they had the same logic down south. An hour later he was washed, dressed and fed as a platter of bread, salt and fruits had been brought to him by a servant, and he was being led through the palace corridors once more to meet with Prince Doran, uncle to the murdered dragon babes and brother to the violated woman that had ignited Ned's ire against Robert. When the door opened and the Northern Lord stepped into the solar, the first thing that crossed his mind was that it looked a lot like his father's, now his, solar back in Winterfell. It was plain and simple, with a desk and a few chairs and the walls covered in bookcases, all made from the same finely crafted wood that gave an earthy tone to the room. He then took a moment to observe his hosts as he made his way to the offered seat. Prince Doran was a man of around 35 years of age, with bright eyes and hard lines on his face. He looked at Ned with a stern and intelligent eye, and a face that could not be easily interpreted. Prince Oberyn, however, was slightly younger and much easier to read. The slight tightening around his eyes and the furrowing of his brows showed his displeasure at having to play host to a man who had assisted in the deposition in the Targaryens. "Lord Stark." Prince Doran greeted, his voice just as unreadable as his face. "What brings you to Sunspear?" "Straight to the point then." Ned nodded once to himself before speaking, his eyes alternating between the two brothers to show that his words were meant for both. "I came to express my condolences for the loss of you sister, niece and nephew, and to apologize for my part in the events which made their deaths possible." It was a risk, he knew, to discuss Princess Elia and her children with her brothers, and even to come to Sunspear in the first place, but he had no choice. It was no surprise that Oberyn bristled at his words and began to rise from his seat in fury, only to be held back by his elder brother. "Thank you for your words," Doran said, but his eyes showed the same rage as Oberyn's had. "But if the new king wishes to get Dorne back into his good graces—" "I do not come on behalf of Robert," Ned interrupted. He was just as unrestrained as the younger prince and let his rage be seen to all. "The king," he spat, "laughed when he was presented with bodies of your niece and nephew. He didn't even glance at Princess Elia. No, I do not come for Robert, nor will you ever hear any words of his from my mouth. I came for myself. Because she was no threat and they were mere babes. Because Aegon was smashed against a wall until his brains were visible and Rhaenys was stabbed 100 times, and I could nothing more than stare at their bodies once the deed was done." The princes were slightly taken aback by the tirade. The words and even the tone itself was borderline treason, against his own foster brother, his best friend. But Northerners were not known to lie, and even if they were, Doran was shrewder than most, and this was no lie. The way Ned spoke, the way he spat his words in disgust and the way his hands clenched beneath the desk made it clear that Lord Stark was genuine. "I came," the Lord continued, "because I went to war for a dead brother and father. And now half of your family is gone, just like mine." "Thank you, Lord Stark," Prince Doran responded softly. This time there was no rage in his eyes and his words were genuine. "And you also have my condolences for the loss of your family." Ned nodded in thanks, and the trio remained in silence for a moment, reminiscing on those they had lost, on the grief and rage that consumed them. They stayed quiet for minutes, sipping on wine and nibbling on fruit that was on a platter on the desk as they thought about their hopeless situation. I have also come because I would like to foster a closer relationship between the North and Dawn. Ned spoke up once more once he had come back to himself. In what way? Doran asked, cocking a head to the side. You have a son and I have a daughter, however in Dawn it is the eldest that inherits regardless of gender, and I struggle to believe you would consent to giving up your only heir to be prince consort to my Orianne. You would be right, I am not here for a betrothal. The Northerner agreed. Rather I would have a trade deal between our two kingdoms. And what do you have to trade, Lord Stark, that Dawn would be interested in? Prince Oberyn finally lifted his head from his half-empty cup of wine to address their guest. A slight smile took over his face then, even while Ned's eyes continued to show the grief he felt. I have been in Dawn for over a month, and in that time I have wished for nothing more than for a piece of the northern cold. I would trade ice with you, Prince Oberyn. To keep the food you eat and the wine you drink cool enough to comfort you in this heat. I hear you have sweet desserts that you cool in the night's shade. With ice this will make them all the more cold and refreshing. Ice. The elder brother repeated, brows furrowing in confusion. Indeed. You may have heard but we have plenty in the north. Ned joked, once more pulling his lips into a slight smile to avoid confronting his dark thoughts and the tension that still remained in the room. Believe it or not, it also has medicinal purposes. In the north we soothe bruises and bumps with packs of snow to reduce swelling, and people take ice baths to treat fevers. It may be a simple thing, easily found where I am from, but it has many uses. The two Dornish princes were intrigued. Never before had anyone seen the need to trade ice of all things, and yet the advantages that Lord Stark described were certainly useful. And what would the price be for the ice, assuming we accept this deal? Prince Doran asked. I would be willing to send one full trading cog to Dawn without charging you coin. Instead I would request a favor of Prince Oberyn. If you appreciate the first shipload and wish to confirm the setup of a trading route, then we may discuss price at that time. One elegant eyebrow raised, Prince Oberyn swirled his cup of wine slowly as his brothers and guests' eyes turned to him. And what favor would you ask of me, Lord Stark? Ned cleared his throat before answering. I understand you are a well-traveled, charismatic man who has many friends all over Westeros and Essos. When the prince confirmed with a slightly confused nod, Ned continued. I would request that you send as many men looking for work as you can north. Architects, shipwrights, miners, warriors, merchants. Whoever is willing, let them know that before long, the north will have work for them. This was critical. The north was not greatly populated, and more than that, the land was so hard that the inhabitants were mainly focused on farming what they could than they were at changing the status quo. If he wanted the north to become powerful, he needed more workers and more qualified men. All his plans would go down the drain if he did not get this, or at best they would be postponed by years or even decades. He could not afford that. The two princes stared at him, baffled as to why he would need so many men of so many different trades, their brows furrowed in confusion, and Ned simply stared back, awaiting an answer. You would send us a full ship of ice, in exchange for a few measly letters? Prince Doran asked finally. Yes. Why? That is all I need at the moment. Ned responded simply. I have plans for the north and none of them can happen without qualified men. I also want to ensure a happy and mutually beneficial trade deal between us both, and this allows you to sample the product I want to sell before any agreement is made. Well, Prince Doran began. In this case I would be happy to agree to a first ship. Oberyn. I agree to the favor asked. Oberyn responded, eyeing Ned closely. May I ask what plans you have for the north, Lord Stark? I must say I am quite intrigued. Once more, Ned nodded once as he leaned forward slightly, a new glint in his eyes. I plan to make the north powerful once more. Increase trade, increase farming, increase wealth. I mean to make my kingdom prosperous and undefeatable. Undefeatable? Oberyn asked, his eyes darkening just a touch. The war has just ended, why would the north need to be undefeatable now? Doran raised an eyebrow at that question, also feeling something stirring within him at the Northern Lord's words. The brothers exchanged a grim glance and wondered if they were right in thinking that this trade deal might just be the best opportunity they had had in years. Yes, undefeatable. There is a reason the North was never conquered before the arrival of dragons, Ned stated, his voice firm and the rage glowing once more in his dark eyes. People forget that it is not to a crown that Torren knelt, nor was it to a throne made of swords, but rather a dragon. And dragons have been extinct for 150 years. Oaths held us back from rebelling since then, but I have sworn no oaths to Robert the Childslayer Baratheon, nor do I intend to. The kings of winter shall return once more, and I would cast a curse upon myself before considering Robert my king. Chapter 2. There was silence in the solar for what seemed to be hours. The princes stared at Lord Stark, all of their shock visible on their faces, even for Doran, who was usually much more reserved and adept at hiding his thoughts. A servant entered and replaced the wine pitcher and the fruit platter before leaving the trio in silence once more, and Ned observed how the two communicated silently through looks and facial expressions. He waited patiently for them to finish, for them to speak and show any sign of positive or negative reaction at what he had just said, hiding his anxiety at having exposed his plans. But this was necessary, he reminded himself. Even if he were to separate from the Iron Throne, he would need allies, and who better than the brothers of the murdered princess? The enemy of my enemy is my friend, he reminded himself. Finally, Doran and Oberyn turned their attention back to their guest, all hints of shock disappearing from their faces as they took up once more the roles of leaders of the kingdom. You would rebel against Robert Baratheon? Doran asked. Aye. And you would like an alliance with Dorne? Oberyn continued. Aye. The brothers sat back in their chairs as one, and Oberyn sipped his wine as they sat in consideration of their guest. What of the Iron Throne? What of it? Ned responded with a slight shrug. It is not the Iron Throne I wish to claim or ally myself with. If we were to assist you in claiming your own throne, would you aid us in disposing of the child killer? Oberyn clarified, eyeing the Northerner carefully. As your ally, I would be honor bound to assist you in any wars to come, of course, but who would you ask me to help you put on the Iron Throne to replace Robert? Viserys Targaryen, Doran stated. We would see a Targaryen restoration. As the last male of the family, he is the heir and the rightful king. It was ironic, Ned thought, that they were planning a restoration barely 3 months after the rebellion itself. Mirroring the brothers' actions from moments before, the Northern Lord sat back in his chair to ponder his options. Viserys was not the rightful king, he knew, but how could he tell them this? How could he trust them with this secret after he had promised his dear sister that he would protect his nephew with his life? But then again, he had just trusted them with his plans to separate from the Iron Throne, which was treason and a death sentence for his family anyway. As he considered his choice, he observed the princes as they watched him quietly, allowing him a moment to think. They were both sat close to the desk, on the edge of their seats, and stared at him with steady consideration and hope. Hadn't they also trusted him with their own plans of treason? You would see a Targaryen restoration, he asked finally, and the brothers nodded as one. Then I cannot support Viserys' claim. Hope turned to shock and rage, Oberyn once more rising from his chair in a sudden move that threw the seat backwards, toppling onto the floor as he stood over the desk, his hands trembling in fury. What, he seethed, brushing off Doran's calming hand. You come to us with thoughts of treason, you claim to be our ally, but you would support that murderer over the rightful king. I will support the restoration, Ned stated, watching the younger prince carefully. It was not for nothing that they called him the Red Viper. But Viserys is not the heir. This seemed to both calm and infuriate Oberyn at the same time, but at least he did not avoid his brother's restraining hand on his arm this time. Doran, however, looked sharply at their guest as he heard the meaning of his words. Explain, he demanded. Lord Stark sighed. He could still turn back now, agree to support Viserys and keep Jon safe and innocent, keep him away from all of this. But with all the treason and secrets shared in the past hour, there was no harm in revealing another, and Lyanna's story protected the boy from the Martells at least. What people know about the beginning of the rebellion is a lie, he began. My sister Lyanna was not kidnapped, Rhaegar did not take her against her will. She ran away. Away from Winterfell, from her family, and most of all from a betrothal to a man that already had at least one bastard. She met Roriger and Elia at the tourney at Harrenhal, almost 2 years ago now, and they fell in love. I know this. Oberyn interrupted, picking up his chair and taking his seat once more, his face betraying his shock. Doran turned to his younger brother so quickly Ned was worried he might snap his neck in the process. Elia wrote to me after the tourney, he continued softly, looking his brother in the eye. She says Roriger brought Lyanna to meet her. They spoke many times over the following week, whenever Lyanna could escape from her family, and before long Roriger was not the only one in love with the she-wolf. The prince stopped and clasped a hand over his brother's, who was staring at him in shock. They had believed that Roriger had scorned Elia when he had named Lyanna his queen of love and beauty after the joust, but if Elia's letter to Oberyn was to be believed, the three of them were actually closer than anyone could have believed. Elia told me in her letter that Prince Roriger wished for a third child, something to do with a prophecy, but Elia was incapable after Egon, and so they agreed that he would take a second wife, with Elia's approval. You're saying? Oberyn turned back to Ned, his eyes glistening with tears at the memory. You're saying they succeeded? Aye, he answered softly. Roriger and Lyanna married in front of a heart tree in the eyes of the old gods so that it would not invalidate his marriage to your sister in the eyes of the faith. Lyanna died in childbed. She gave birth to a son, Jaehaerys Targaryen, heir to the Iron Throne, and my nephew. Our nephew. Oberyn responded fiercely, tears now threatening to fall. He is just as much Elia's son than he is Lyanna's. Jaehaerys. Doran whispered reverently. May we see him? Ned nodded and led them back through the same corridors he had travelled a few hours earlier, to the chambers next to the ones given to him where he found his nephew along with the wet nurse Wyler. With only a look, Wyler was dismissed, bowing slightly before scurrying out of the room and leaving the baby in the delicately carved cradle. The child was sleeping peacefully, less than a moon old and still fragile and helpless, but the Dornish princes looked upon him with reverence of all hope restored, the shattered pieces of their heart slowly being melded back together with each tiny breath the child took. Not for the first time, Ned thanked the gods that the child did not have any obvious Targaryen features, instead having inherited the dark Stark hair and eyes. I call him Jon. Lord Stark said softly, and the brothers nodded even as they kept their eyes on the babe. Until the time is right. Doran agreed. That night they feasted. The lords and ladies and important household members gathered in the great hall around various southern dishes that were completely novel to Lord Stark and Reed as they celebrated the new trade alliance between the North and Dorne, however tentative it was for now. The princes and the northern lords, however, knew that in reality they were toasting to the future, to King Jaehaerys and to the revenge of Elia Martell and Rhaenys and Aegon Targaryen. Further plans were made. Ned divulged his ideas for the North in more detail and gave his opinions when asked by the princes as they reflected on how to strengthen their own kingdom, and letters were sent. Lord Stark instructed Lords Umber and Karstark to meet at the Bay of Seals to begin cutting the ice and requested that Lord Marndaly send one of his trading cogs to join them a month later. Oberyn sent ravens to a multitude of his friends that resided all over the known world, inviting them to the north with promises of work. Ned stayed for another 3 weeks at Sunspear, firstly to continue his discussions with House Martell and secondly to allow his nephew to grow a little more before demanding such a long trip of him. The north was on the other side of Westeros after all, and it would take at least 3 months for them to get home. Such a journey was not good for one so young. There had been an argument regarding who would raise Jon, as the Martells offered to host him at Sunspear until the time for the restoration came, raising him as one of their own, but Ned vehemently objected to this. They may consider the child their nephew, but he was Ned's by blood and by right, and Ned would not be giving up on him so soon. There had been another argument when the Martell princes realized that Ned intended to claim the boy as his own bastard, bringing dishonor on both himself and their future king. Lord Stark explained that the North was very much like Dorne when it came to bastards, not eligible to inherit but not looked down upon, not sneered at and not treated any differently than true-born children. He was adamant that this would be his dishonor only, not Jon's, until the princes had pointed out that his wife was from the Riverlands and she would be bringing a household full of guards, servants and handmaidens to Winterfell with her, all of whom would treat the boy like dirt on their shoes. Lord Stark agreed to claim the boy was his brother Brandon's after that. A bastard still he would be, but not a personal slight against Lady Catelyn, and therefore she would be easily convinced that he was to be treated correctly. Especially if she wanted to live in the north, where the biased teachings of the faith were not followed. Considering he was planning on breaking free of the south, Ned had no qualms about annulling his marriage if his new wife was unable to adhere to northern customs. The matter of Viserys and Daenerys, the two Targaryens across the Narrow Sea, was also discussed. They were currently under the supervision of Willem d'Ary, who had managed to smuggle them to Essos just before Stannis Baratheon's fleet had sailed to Dragonstone to take them to the new king, where no doubt they would have been killed just like Aegon and Rhaenys, and were living in a house rented from the Sea Lord of Braavos. It was agreed that they could not come back to Westeros until they were ready for the restoration, as Baratheon was aware of the two and was actively pursuing them with guards and assassins. Instead, Oberyn would travel to meet them, and he would bring more swords with him to ensure their safety. While there, he would find a place more inland for them to stay, as Braavos was the foremost port in all of Essos and thousands of strangers passed through the city every day. Away from any trading hubs, they would be safer from unknown assassins. Before Ned left, one last matter was proposed to him, a betrothal between Princess Arianne and Jon. The thought of his sister running away from a betrothal prevented Ned from outright agreeing to promise his nephew. In fact, all of his children would have a say over who they married. Instead, he agreed to foster young Arianne when they were older, and present the idea of a betrothal to Jon once they had gotten to know each other. "Take care of our nephew, Lord Stark," Prince Doran said, shaking the Northern Lord's hand while his other had a tight grip on his cane. Ned thought that before long, the Martell Prince would no longer be able to walk even with the aid of a cane, and instead be confined to sitting all day due to his gout. "I shall." Ned nodded once before releasing the prince's hand and mounting the horse that the stable boy brought him. When Ned Stark first came to Sunspear, he had arrived with only the clothes on his back, 2 companions, a child and a cart that held his dead sister's embalmed body. Now he left with those same companions, but Lyanna's corpse had been placed in a carriage befitting of her station in life, and they had an addition of a dozen guards, a desert guide and another 2 carts to hold the clothes, food and drink that had been gifted to them. The party made their way through the city, the people moving to the side of the road to let them pass as they threw flowers and silk handkerchiefs at the travelers, all of them having heard of the new friendship between their 2 kingdoms. Following the River Green Blood, the party made their way west to get past the Sea of Dawn before they could join the King's Road at Weirwood. As they traveled, the guide told the baffled northerners how, through the use of pipes, they carried the water from the river to the lands further away, so that they could expand their fertile land and farm further away from the river than they usually could. Intrigued, they asked more of the local farmers when they stopped at God's Grace a week into their journey. It was explained to them that, like the north, most of the Dornish lands were barren and unable to be farmed, but this was fixed by simply carrying and diverting the water from the rivers to the farms through copper pipes, which allowed the usually dry and arid soil to become fertile enough to farm. That night, Ned sent another raven to the mountain clans of the north, asking them to begin mining as much copper as they could. They traveled for months, stopping in any villages or towns when they needed to replenish their supplies, but otherwise pressing on, camping on the side of the road when they had to and allowing Wyler and Jon the use of one of the carriages when there was enough room. 2 months into their journey, they passed King's Landing. No matter how much they wanted to, on Ned's instruction the party did not stop, as this would mean they would have to see the king, and not only would it be expected of him to say his vows of fealty to King Robert, but it was also bringing Jon a little too close to where his half-siblings had died for his comfort. If he simply did not stop by the Red Keep, it would be attributed to his grief for his sister, and Ned doubted that Robert would drag him back south to say his vows, so confident he was in their everlasting friendship. Instead, they continued their path north towards Riverrun, where Ned's new wife and child awaited. It took another month to reach their destination. The entire household was waiting for them in the main courtyard of the castle, with Hoster Tully in the center, flanked by his 2 children, Edmure and Catelyn, who was holding a small bundle in her arms. "Lord Stark." Lord Tully greeted, his mouth widening into a grin as he clasped hands with his godson. "Lord Tully, thank you for your hospitality." Ned nodded, before moving to his wife. "Welcome, Lord Stark," she said, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "Please meet our son. I named him Rob, after your friend our king." Ned struggled to hold back a frown at that. Rob was a good name that was broad enough in origin that it would be welcome in the north. However, did she really have to name their heir after the man he had just spent the past 4 months plotting against? He peered over his wife's arms to catch a glimpse of his son. Rob would be the same age as John, though if anyone looked at them side by side they would never believe that this red-haired little boy was the Stark. Still, he had a healthy son and that was all that mattered. A smile graced his lips as he placed a hand on his wife's shoulder and a kiss on his child's head. "My lord." Tearing his eyes from his son, he looked up to his wife who was staring out further into the courtyard. Ned turned, concerned at the worry, confusion and hurt in his new wife's voice, only to see that Wyler had stepped out of the carriage she had been riding in and was stood by the horses, holding little John in her arms. His smile widening, he reached out an arm towards her to beckon her forth. "Caitlin," he said once Wyler and John were close enough. "This is my nephew, John." It seemed everyone in the courtyard let out a breath at the same time, as all had been worried that this was some bastard Ned had sired while at war. Unlike Rob, there were no blankets covering little John and as such his stark features were displayed for all to see. "Nephew?" Lord Hoster asked, finally dragging his eyes away from the young newcomer to stare at Ned, who nodded once. My brother Brandon's son." An understanding gleam shone in the Tully family and they all nodded, satisfied by the answer. There was no need to ask about the boy's status as it was known that Brandon had not married. In fact, he had been set to marry Caitlin but had died before he could do so, leaving Ned to take her in his place. Any child of Brandon's would be a bastard. They stayed at Riverrun for a week, and Hoster held a feast on their last night to celebrate Lord Stark and the heir that Caitlin had given him. Ned appreciated it, and he was happy to be in the comfort of a castle once more, but he couldn't help but feel less welcome with his good family than he had staying in Sunspear. He was glad to be leaving. He had been away from home for far too long, allowing his younger brother Benjen to rule in his stead at only 15 years old, though Ned supposed he wouldn't be much better. As a second son he had never been trained to be a lord, and yet now he was making plans to improve the north like none had before, all with the goal of one day rising from a lord to a king. It was difficult to imagine, and yet the plans had been made, the events had been set in motion, and independence of the north was within his grasp. Chapter 3. Hello, hope everyone is enjoying themselves so far. Since I'm going to be getting further into trading and projects that will involve plenty of financial talk, I thought I would go into detail on monetary values. First we have the copper star, of which there are 100 in a silver stag, and there are 100 silver stags in a gold dragon. Most small folk get paid a few coppers per day and could never hope of holding a whole gold dragon, but for the nobility it's a little different. The south is of course much richer than the north, and gold dragons are practically pennies to southern nobility, which explains why Baelish could offer a bet of 100 dragons during the tourney in the series. But even in the north where practicality trumps frivolity, a few dragons here and there is perfectly acceptable spending money for nobles despite how out of reach it is for the small folk. I hope that clears the rest of this up, and if not, please let me know. Looking at the massive procession that followed him now, it was difficult to believe that just few months ago, his party had only consisted of 5 people, one of whom was dead. Now, there was the 3 carts and dozen guards from Dawn, as well as another dozen guards from Riverrun, around 20 household servants, 3 personal handmaidens, another wet nurse and 3 more carts containing food and Lady Caitlin's dowry. All in all, it was safe to say that Ned had company on his travels north, and yet once Howland had left him after crossing the Twins, he had never felt more alone. For all the people in his expanded party, none knew of his plans for the North and the 7 Kingdoms, none knew of his agreements with the Martells, and none barring Wyler knew of John's true identity. Caitlin had tried to have the wet nurse and John travel at the back of the procession at first, until Ned had firmly told her that he was family and therefore he would be traveling with the family. What's more, any time Ned took to spend with his son, he also had Wyler drop John off so that they could both intermingle with each other. This had led to a hushed argument between husband and wife where Caitlin decried his decision to keep them so close. "The bastard will corrupt my boy," she had cried. Lord Stark had told her in no uncertain terms that if she wanted to remain his wife, then she should do her best to adapt to northern customs, and in the north it was not taught that bastards were perverse creatures that would usurp their true-born family's place. Instead they were welcomed and treated like family because they were family. John was her nephew and Caitlin would learn to love him or she would be sent back to her father. There would be no utterance of the word bastard and John was to be given every right and luxury that Rob was. They didn't speak for the next week, until Ned had ordered Wyler into the same carriage as Caitlin, Rob and his wet nurse. There, Caitlin had to deal with John whether she wanted to or not, and she found after just a few days that she didn't actually mind traveling with the boy. At barely 6 months old, Rob and John seemed to get on like a house on fire, waving their little arms at each other and babbling incoherently. They stayed in the same carriage for 2 weeks before they arrived at Winterfell. Home. It was enough to bring Ned to near tears. The sight of the mighty castle brought a breath of fresh air to the young man who had already seen too much. It reminded him of his lost family and those who remained. Just like he had when they approached Sunspear, Ned spurred his horse into a faster pace, the party following shortly behind him as they almost raced to the great walls. As expected, the household was waiting in the courtyard for their new lord and his family to arrive. Most had tears in their eyes at seeing the man they remembered as just a young boy before he went off to war, but Lord Stark only had eyes for his brother. Foregoing all protocol, Ned threw himself into Benjen's arms, both men doing their best to keep their tears from falling as they whispered affectionate words to each other. Much too soon, they had to separate so that Ned could introduce the new members of the family to his brother. He greeted Caitlin like a proper gentleman and congratulated them both when he held Rob in his arms, cooing over the young child, and when John was placed on his arms Ned saw on his brother's face the same reverence and love that he had seen on the Martells. One last gift from their lost sibling. Feasts were not commonplace in the north, the scarcity of food preventing any such waste for the sake of frivolities, but they still ate well that night. The cooks had roasted a whole deer that the hunters had brought back from their last trip to be eaten with roast potatoes and gravy, and a stew was available for those that wished, filled with rabbit and vegetables that warmed Ned's heart. In the south they had feasted on caramelized pork, honeyed chicken, boiled lobster and crab, stews that burned the tongue due to exotic spices and flavors, and they had even tasted chocolate deserts in Dawn, but none of it was as wonderful as northern dishes, Ned thought. Yes, it was good to be home, but not everything was hearty meals and touching greetings between family members. The morning after their arrival, Ned had summoned his younger brother to the solar that had once belonged to their father to explain what had happened in Dawn and his plan for the future of the North. Benjen was just as baffled as Doran and Oberyn had been and the meeting was just as tumultuous and emotional. "You can't go to the Night's Watch, Benjen," Ned pleaded. "I need your help here. There is so much to do, so much to manage and take care of, I can't do it all by myself." "Don't worry, Ned," Benjen soothed his brother. "I won't be going anywhere, but remember you're not alone. There's not just me but your new wife as well." "No. She cannot know about this. This is treason, and though I have wedded and bedded her, I don't know her, Benjen. I cannot trust her with this after her family fought a war to put Robert on the throne." With a simple nod from Benjen, the matter was put to the side and the younger Stark began advising his brother on all that he had missed, the state of their coffers and granaries, letters that needed to be read, disputes among the lords and any additions or losses in their vassal houses. With most of the men off to war, it was not surprising that there had been few births or pregnancies in the past year, though hopefully that would change soon. The reserves of coin and food were also low, another consequence of the war, but shipments of copper had begun to arrive from the mountain clans as Ned had instructed, and Benjen had already asked the smiths to begin fashioning pipes as indicated in the letters they had exchanged. One letter that brought a true smile to Ned's face, however, was one that had arrived just a week before from the Martells. The first shipment of ice had arrived just a month and a half after his departure and they were more than pleased with the results. As promised, it was a boon in cooling and preserving food and could be used by maesters to heal less severe injuries or sicknesses. Additionally, a whole ton of it had been passed on to the cooks so that they could devise new and luxurious foods to enjoy. Needless to say, they were more than happy to make their trade alliance official. More letters were sent, first to the northernmost houses of Umber, Karstark and Mormont with instructions to continue harvesting the ice in the Bay of Seals and the Bay of Ice near their domains, and to set up permanent encampments with workers to make their efforts less grueling in the future. Then a letter was sent to Sunspear to begin the negotiations on pricing. Ravens flew back and forth between the two kingdoms as the communications took place, and merely a month later it was agreed that the Martells would pay 5 gold dragons per ton and that 3 cogs containing the product would be sent per month. Since one cog could carry up to 200 tons at a time, Ned considered it a great first step towards their plans. Of course, this increase in wealth was not just to the benefit of the Starks, as Ned had also had to negotiate with the Umbers, Karstarks and Mormonts what their share would be, and it was decided that each house would receive 10% of the profits, and another 10% to go to House Glover, who would be providing the sawdust which would keep the ice from melting on the journey, as well as House Marndale, who would be transporting the goods south. That was 6 major houses of the north that increased their wealth greatly thanks to this new trade deal. While these negotiations took place, Benjen took care of the copper piping, having himself sent a raven to Sunspear and receiving in response the plans and instructions for the copper irrigation technique. He was now in charge of overseeing the construction of many miles worth of copper piping, which would be sent to all of the northern houses for free in the hopes that it would improve their harvests and help them come winter. He seemed to greatly enjoy himself, the deaths of his family no longer weighing him down as it had during those first few days, and he could often be found in the fields outside Winterfell stalking around a group of young men and eyeing them critically as they assembled small pieces of piping together to make a larger network. Despite this new influx of wealth and activity, not all was great in the castle, and Ned found himself struggling to get to know his new wife. Despite them already having shared a bed and having conceived a child together, Catelyn was unusually bashful and prude around him. They slept separately, and the times Ned visited her in her chambers, she would stand and begin to disrobe silently and solemnly until he stopped her. "We have done our duty," he would say. "And you have given me an heir. I would now get to know my wife." Naturally, he wished for nothing more than to feel the pleasure of her flesh again, but he hated the way she would look at him with a blank face whenever she thought he had come for her, as if it was a duty she had no choice or desire in doing. He would have her enjoy him as he enjoyed her, look upon him with some slight hint of affection rather than just obedience and submission. It took him almost a full week to get her to call him Eddard rather than my lord, and that was not even counting the time they had spent together on the road. It took longer for her to give him a genuine smile or to call him Ned, as many others did. She did however take to being Lady of Winterfell like a fish took to water, immediately familiarizing herself with the various household members and meeting with the steward whenever she could to discuss how the keep was usually run so that she could take over eventually. Another thing that ended Ned to his wife was her newfound affection for Jon, as it seemed even Catelyn was not immune to how close her son and nephew were. Whenever she visited Robb in the nursery, she made sure to take some time for Jon as well, sitting in an armchair in the corner while she sewed and watching the children with a smile on her face when she got tired of playing with them. The same could not be said for all those that came north with her from Riverrun, however. One of the servants had been dismissed on the spot when Catelyn had entered the nursery one day to find her occupying Robb and ignoring Jon's screams as he was left in his crib, which had been pushed to the far corner of the room near the window where a slight draught of cold northern air was hitting the poor boy. The Southerners' treatment of Jon had led to a slight disagreement one day when Ned and Catelyn had been speaking and the scepter that she had brought with her came up in the conversation. "I will not have my children educated in the ways of the faith," Ned stated firmly. "But Eddard, religion is one of the most important things to me, please," his wife pleaded. "The faith of the 7 preach lessons that have no place in the north," the Lord continued, unwilling to back down. "On the matter of how women should behave, for one. And the north remembers how the Septons burned our weirwood trees and drove the first men north. You know how the faith sees bastards, and I will not have my children be lectured on how their cousin is naturally sinful and inclined to deviousness and greed. I see how your Septa Mordain looks at Jon, and I will not allow her to spread her prejudices to our children, and I'm sure even you can agree with me on this considering how you love the boy. Septars are meant to teach children the way of the world. How will they learn otherwise, without Septa Mordain's guidance? Are our children meant to bow down to trees rather than be part of the light of the gods?" Ned had had to take a deep breath to calm himself at that. "Catelyn," he began, speaking calmly but firmly, "I am well aware of how the old gods are seen in the south, and how we are considered barbarians for considering nature sacred. But this is not the south, this is the north, and Robb will one day be Lord Paramount and he must embody all of our customs and traditions. In that case, allow me at least to educate any other children," Catelyn continued to beg. Any other children we have will also be raised in the light of the old gods, despite not ruling as Rob will, for the reasons I mentioned previously. Words spoken against bastards are words spoken against my nephew, and I will not allow it. And that was the end of it. Septa Mordane was allowed to remain in Winterfell for the comfort of Lady Catelyn, but she would never educate the children in the ways of the South. If the North was going to become independent, then Ned, and Rob after him, would need to be a beacon, a figurehead, an example of what it meant to be Northern. Rob would most likely have to marry one of the daughters of his bannermen in order to keep the blood of the first men and the Stark looks in the family, as he already looked Southern with his red hair and blue eyes. But that was a matter for later, when the boy was old enough to decide. Around the same time as their conversation regarding Septa Mordane, just 3 months after Ned had returned home, a party of heavily armed guards arrived from White Harbor, followed by almost 100 men and women, escorting multiple carriages from Dawn as the first trading ships returned home. At the head of the large procession was Wylis Marndale, second son to Lord Wendell, riding on a horse large and strong enough to carry the fat man's weight. One by one, the carriages containing what Ned could only assume was trunks of gold entered through the great gates of the castle and parked themselves to the side of the courtyard, under Lord Wylis' instruction. The guards followed, diligently remaining close to the treasure despite being within the safety of the castle walls, but the others that accompanied the party milled around, whispering among themselves as they craned their necks to take in the view. Lord Stark. Wylis greeted boisterously, struggling off his horse before making his way over to the Starks. I bring with me the payment from Dawn for the first shipment of ice as stated in our new trading alliance. This is of course Winterfell's 50% of the gold, and the rest of the coin is making its way to its various owners as we speak. Thank you, Lord Wylis, for ensuring its safe delivery. Ned responded, a slight smile on his face. Next to him, Catelyn looked on curiously. Of course she had been made aware that there was a new trade agreement between the North and Dawn, however she had not been told of the details. How much gold have we made? She asked. 1,500 gold dragons. Wylis responded in that booming voice that echoed across the courtyard. All around, any activity stopped and there was a massive gasp across the courtyard as the various members of the household heard the amount. Never before had a single shipment of gold contained that much coin in the North, the only exception being to the foresters when they traded their ironwood, which only grew in the wolfswood and was therefore a luxury that was in very high demand. However, in order to preserve the integrity of the forest, trading ships carrying ironwood were very few and far between. Even in the South, the amount of gold they had collected for just 3 ships full of ice was nothing to be scoffed at, though not considered anything near a small fortune as it was in the North. I also bring guests that insist you requested their presence. The Marndale continued once the shock of the gold had worn off, waving a hand towards the small crowds of tanned families that were clustered together on the other side of the courtyard, the stable boy having taken their horses as soon as they arrived. At his gesture, one middle-aged man separated himself from the group and made his way over. Like the others, he was tanned with dark hair that was graying at the sides and laugh lines around his eyes. Reaching the Stark family, the man bowed once to Ned before introducing himself. My Lord Stark, I am Gillim DeLorne, Master Architect of Bravos. He said to everyone's surprise save Ned's. My good friend Oberyn passed by Bravos a few months ago and said that you would be grateful for my presence and that of some of my workers. It was a statement, but the man's tone also hinted at a little questioning. Clearly Prince Oberyn had not explained the reason he was needed in the North. Why would Prince Oberyn send you here, Master DeLorne? Catelyn asked. He did so on my request. Lord Stark responded, reaching out a hand to welcome the newcomer. Thank you for coming, Master DeLorne. Your friend was right and I am very grateful that you have come. There will be plenty of work to be done, though I fear we will have to wait for a few more shipments like this to arrive before we can move forward with my plans. He waved a hand in the direction of the carriages that were being led away by the steward to the coffer vaults. In the meantime, please feel free to settle your people in Winterfell and Wintertown, and if you require any aid please feel free to come and see me. With a nod of acceptance, the master returned to his people and began to recount what Lord Stark had told him while Ned welcomed Lord Wylis inside the castle and to stay for the night before returning home. Though he showed a professional and welcoming facade, on the inside, Ned was dancing with glee. At this rate, they would be able to put their first plans into action within just a few months. Chapter 4 I've just received word from the last of the lords that your teams have been received and have begun their work. Benjamin nodded once, eyes still on the enlarged map of the north that was on the desk in his brother's solar. With his new gold, Ned had commissioned a brand new map of his lands that was 3 times as large as the previous one that their father had decorating his wall when he was still alive, and much more detailed. Not that there was much detail to add for now, but with any luck, that would change. This new map marked every farm, every town and village, every keep and ruin, but the most prominent thing that the map showed at the moment was all the empty flat land that was still unused. The plan was to update the map over the years as they moved to change the north. Good, that means we will be ready for the next crop sowing in a few months. You've done good work, Ned complimented. We will be able to at least double our farmland before the crops are sown, and after the harvest we may be able to extend it even further. I hope you kept that cartographer nearby, the younger brother joked, finally raising his head to look at Ned. And what of everything else? You have news? This time it was Ned that nodded once, eyes lowering to the map. Aye. The materials have arrived at Moat Cailin and construction on the canal will commence within the next few weeks. The canal. The first of Lord Stark's great plans and the cheapest excluding the irrigation network. Master DeLorme had been questioned in detail on the canals of Bravos and he had assured them that though the distance was greater than any of the others he had built, the master architect would be able to cut from Moat Cailin to White Harbour, joining the Fever River to sea. This would allow an increase in trade and naval travel, reducing the time it took for ships carrying precious and perishable food from the Reach to arrive in the north, as well as making the north more defendable. Once the canal was complete, strong ironwood gates would be erected to control the use of the canal and a small toll would have to be paid for any non-northern ships wishing to use it. Enemy ships would be completely trapped with no choice but to turn around and go home, preventing the risk of invasion. How many men does DeLorme have? 1,000 from Winterfell to start with, and I have petitioned every lord to send at least 100 each. Hopefully they are on their way, and by the time the work starts he will have over 3,000 men under his command. He states that he can get it completed in 6 to 8 months. A whistle sounded from Benjamin's mouth and he raised an eyebrow. He works fast. Either that or he overestimates his capabilities, but I doubt it. Ned responded, a smile gracing his lips as he thought of how fast everything was moving. Already, hundreds of men had come from all over the known world at Prince Oberyn's request and were now being hosted in Wintertown and provided for by Lord Stark until he had a need of them, though more than a few had already been dispatched across the north. The gold was steadily pouring in from dawn and financing Ned's projects. The north was in a flurry of movement like never before as irrigation networks were set up. Carts of seed and grain arrived at each town in preparation for the crop sowing, materials were being shipped from all over the kingdom to Moat Cailin and the foresters were chopping down their precious ironwood at a rate they had previously been hesitant to work at, all on the instruction of a second son who had the misfortune of having his elders die before their time. The scouts have also been sent out. Lord Stark continued after a short moment of silence. Scouts? Aye, the Westerlanders. And hadn't that been a surprise, when vassals to the man who had ordered the murder of the Dornish princess had arrived at Winterfell, claiming to be here at the request of their good friend Oberyn. Apparently, the Martells had once hoped to marry Princess Elia to Jaime Lannister and had spent months at Casterly Rock while a betrothal was discussed. Needless to say, it hadn't gone through and the Lannisters were later responsible for Elia's death, but during those few months Oberyn had made some lifelong friends, it seemed. A few hundred men, all of them experienced in mining and prospecting for hidden wealth, had been welcomed to Winterfell with great enthusiasm until they had been dispatched far and wide to find any hidden caches of wealth that had been missed by the Starks of old. The north had plenty of mines, but apart from the silver mines at White Harbour, these were all iron, copper and tin. Certainly useful, but not much help when it came to trade and wealth building. In a land as vast and diverse as the north, one would expect there to be many more minerals and jewels beneath their feet, but none of Ned's forefathers had found any. Hopefully the Westerlander experts would have better luck. Good, Benjen responded. Hopefully they'll find something worthwhile and we'll have something more to trade. Any idea when we can expect them to have completed the scouting? Ned hummed for a moment as he thought over that question. Perhaps a year or so. There were 30 teams each sent in different directions, but they have a lot of work ahead of them. Well, let's hope it doesn't take too much longer than that. Winter is coming. Soon, he agreed. We'd better get going, the guests will arrive soon. This brought a smile to Ned's face once more. As tradition dictated, the Lords of the North were making their way to Winterfell in honor of the heir's first name day. There would be a feast and gifts and a great celebration in Winterfell over the next few days, and Ned had made sure everyone understood that they would not just be celebrating Robb, but Jon also. After all, if he had anything to say about it, they would both be the future kings in Westeros, and he would ensure their first name day celebration would be something to be remembered. This was one of the only occasions during which the Starks didn't mind spending precious gold on luxury and frivolities, and he had heard that even the Dornish had included some gifts for the boys in their monthly payment, which would be arriving with the Mandaelis later during the day. The castle had been a flurry of activity as the servants scurried about, getting everything ready for the occasion under the sharp eye of Lady Stark. She had greatly adapted to her role as the lady of the castle, Ned thought as he made his way through the corridors. Organizing the servants, ordering hunts and overseeing the decoration of the castle, she had been just as busy as he had, and he was extremely pleased that not once had she needed any aid, though of course the steward was still with her constantly, providing advice and knowledge on which servant did what. Their marriage was going well, for all they had been strangers when they first stood at the altar, and not only had he been welcomed back to her bed with eagerness rather than resignation, she had also agreed after some hesitation to have another small wedding ceremony in front of a heart tree, so that they were bound in the eyes of the old gods as well as the new. This had ended her quite a bit to the bannermen and the household servants, and Ned was certain their future would be a happy one. Long had Winterfell not felt a woman's touch, as Ned's mother Lyra had died in childbed almost 16 years ago, and in that time the castle had grown gloomy and sad. Now that there was a Lady Stark once more, colorful tapestries hung on the walls, paintings of long-dead Starks had been retrieved from the stores where Ned's father had hidden them in a fit of depression and grief, healthy green plants and sweet-smelling flowers were at every corner, and Winterfell once more looked light, as it had during his childhood. All in place for the name day celebration, but Ned hoped most of the changes would remain once the guests had left. Taking a few hours to bathe and ready themselves for their guests, the Starks were ready just in time for the first of the lords to arrive. The afternoon passed quickly, with everyone hurrying between welcoming guests in the courtyard and walking them up to their rooms in the castle, exchanging news as they went. One after the other, parties from all over the north arrived, accompanied by small carts and carriages that carried provisions and gifts for the Starks and their boys. Before long, the sky had turned dark and everyone found themselves in the great hall enjoying their meal as they caught up. It was loud and it was busy, a dozen servants hurried around the room as they fetched food and alcohol, and the lords laughed loudly, Lord Umber the first among them as he slammed his mug of ale to the table with a great roar every time Lord Glover spoke. Despite the noise and the slight smell of sweat, Ned wouldn't wish to be anywhere else. Great smiles shone on everyone's face as they dug into their meals with gusto, though the feast would be the next day. Tonight the tables were laden with simple stews, platters of sausages, roast potatoes and green vegetables. Just a regular northern meal, apart from the trays of pitta and garlic bread that the Dornish had provided the recipe for a few months ago. Ned had sent books on the old tongue in thanks. Ned! Great Jon Umber roared as he made his way up to the high table where the Starks ate. Lord Umber, welcome. How are you? Sloshed as a pig in wine, the large man stumbled slightly as he raised his head in laughter, spilling some of his ale as he went. Not every day our lord's heir celebrates their first name day. Lady Stark. Love what you've done with the place. With a great slap on the shoulder that left his dainty wife coughing, Lord Umber returned to his seat while Ned hurriedly pushed a cup of water towards Catelyn. Multiple times over the evening, various lords came to the high table to pay their respects and have a short conversation with their lord that mainly revolved around the men that were setting up the irrigation network and those that Ned had requested be sent south to Moat Cailin. It was with great relief that he and Catelyn fell into bed that night, too exhausted to even change into their night clothes. The next day was not very eventful, as most of the men had hangovers from the night before, and it wasn't until mid-morning that everyone was finally awake and out of their chambers. Some went to the training yard to spar while a few of the ladies watched, some borrowed a few horses to go for a ride, a few ladies sat on the benches in the courtyard enjoying the sunshine and sewing as they watched young children run around picking flowers and playing games. Little Daisy Mormont at just 5 years old managed to sneak past the kennel master to see the pups that had been born just a few months ago, accidentally leaving the door open, which resulted in a 1-hour chase around the castle to find the pups and return them to the kennel. That evening, however, was the celebration, and if Ned thought the previous evening's dinner was loud, then he was not prepared for the actual feast. Even before the event actually started, the noise was loud enough that one had to shout to be heard by the person sat just next to them. The sun had set once more, the candles had been lit and the drink had been distributed, and Ned finally brought his fingers to his lips to sound out a loud whistle that was heard over the loud cries of the lords. "My lords," he began once everyone had turned their attention to him. "Thank you for coming to celebrate the first name day of my son and nephew. The past few years have been hard, losing both our lord and our heir before going into a bloody war that lost us many other able-bodied men. But death gives way to life, and in the past year that the war has been over, the north has begun to grow once again. Winter is coming, but us northerners are not easily cowed. We will rebuild, we will grow, and we will endure." The speech had the lords and ladies in the room screaming with approval as they raised their mugs in toast, clapping each other on the back and shaking each other's shoulders until Ned once more called for attention. As tradition dictates, Lord Stark continued. "A feast has been prepared for today's celebration, and believe me, my lords, tonight's feast would have even the pampered southerners salivating with desire. Thanks to the gold earned from our new alliance with Dawn, the North will prosper like never before, and the food you will see tonight will be the first evidence of this. But first, in celebration to Rob and John, the first of a post-war generation, the gifts." A roar sounded throughout the hall once again, and Lord Stark took a seat in his intricately carved chair next to his wife, who was holding both boys. Mugs were being drained and servants were bringing chests and cloth-wrapped gifts to their lords so that they may present them to the Starks. The first to step forward was Gia Mormont, Lord of Bear Island. "Lord and Lady Stark," he began, bowing his head to each of them as he stepped forward with his package. "In celebration of the new life that has blessed the Starks, I gift each boy a cloak made from the best bear fur my island has to offer." The cloth was immediately moved to the side to reveal the thick brown fur of the cloaks. Both Ned and his wife reached out and grabbed a cloak each, marveling at the quality. "Not a single hole," Caitlin murmured as she ran her hands through it. "Aye, my lady. Our best archers were dispatched and shot the beasts in the eye so as to not compromise the hide," Lord Mormont responded, bowing once more with a proud smile. "Thank you, Gia. The gift is greatly appreciated and will be immensely useful in future winters." Next was Lord Bolton, who stepped forward and presented a pair of leather rolls that each contained a dozen knives of different size and shape, all finely crafted and beautifully designed. Even the leather sheath had patterns decorating it, different for each child, running wolves for Rob and snowflakes for John, an allusion to their last names no doubt. Once again, the Starks thanked the man and he stepped down to allow another to take his place. It continued for almost an hour, lords and ladies stepping forward to the high table to deposit their gifts. There were cloaks, riding breeches, weapons. Lords Glover and Forrester had clearly coordinated as the first gave a pair of swords with wolf hilts, one black and the other white, and the latter gave matching scabbards. Lord Reed gave a crate full of salves and pastes, and Lord Riswell stepped forward empty-handed but announced that 2 of his best bred foals were waiting in the stables for the boys to grow up. There were a few age-appropriate gifts such as the wolf plush eyes that Lady Dustin had made or the rattle toys from one of the Val girls. The most surprising gift, however, came from Dawn, as Lord Marndaly stepped forward to take his turn. "My Lord and Lady Stark," he bowed. "I bring the boys rolls of the most delicate silk from the Summer Isles." The large man leaned forward to pass the rolls on to Ned, who marveled at the feel of the expensive fabric. Silk was a luxury that could be made only in the hottest of regions, Dawn included, but silk from the Summer Isles was known for its superior quality and durability. It was not cheap at all, and here he had just been handed 2 whole 3-meter rolls of it, each roll being a different color of the Stark sigil, gray and white. "Lord Marndaly, thank you. This is a most generous gift," Ned choked out while his wife was still staring slack-jawed at the fabric in her hands. "Nothing is too much for the heir to the north," the merman responded, standing straight with pride. "I also bring a gift from the Martell Princes of Dawn, a book on the magics of the First Men for young Rob, and a book on ancient Valyria for little John." Once again, Lord Marndaly leant forward to hand the books over, and Ned saw that these were ancient tomes, bound in leather and incredibly well preserved. Looking at the titles, he had never heard of books such as these, and it wasn't too far of a stretch to believe that they were the only copies in the world. Additionally, the Lord continued. They sent a crate each of chocolate, strawberries and bananas, along with a recipe for a type of dessert that they have recently discovered with the help of our ice. I hope you do not mind, my lord, but I have already passed these on to the cooks and requested that they be served at the feast. Of course. What better time to try a new delicacy than when all the lords of the north are gathered together? Ned answered, finally tearing his eyes away from the ostentatious gifts that he had just been handed. Standing from his chair, he once more addressed the room. My lords, on behalf of my boys, I thank you for your gifts and generosity today. This week marks the 1-year anniversary of my sister's death and the end of the war, as well as the birth of a new generation. I hope you will join me in praying that our children know only happiness and prosperity. And now, the feast. Suddenly, doors all around the room opened as servants entered, those coming from behind the high table quickly taking possession of the various gifts to move them to another location, while on the other end of the room dozens of women came in carrying platters of food as men and women all around them cheered at the sight. And Lord Stark did not lie. With their newfound gold, he had allowed himself this one splurge and had gone all out on the feast. There was honeyed boar, roast venison, chicken stuffed with truffles and cream sauce, spicy jalapeno calamari, stuffed peppers and the best arbor gold and Dornish red. The tables groaned under the weight of all the food, and the nobles in the room made sure to try a bit of everything. Over by the far table, there was a concerned cry from Lady Dustin as her father turned red and began spluttering after trying the calamari, before he poured the entire pitcher of arbor gold down his throat, much to the amusement of Mage and Gia Mormont. It would be impossible for everyone to eat the entirety of the food, Ned knew. There was just too much, and he had already arranged for the servants to save the leftovers and take them to feed the poor of Wintertown the next day. Still, the lords and ladies ate until they were lethargic from overeating, more than a few of them groaning and holding their stomachs. Lady Stark smartly ordered the servants to wait another hour before they brought out dessert, to allow everyone a bit of a break from eating. Most took advantage of this to go for a stroll in the courtyard and fill their lungs with outside air to stop themselves from vomiting, and so the party was temporarily relocated. When the desserts were finally brought out, it was late enough that those in the hall once more had eager expression on their faces, and some had even already taken a hold of their cutlery in anticipation of the delicious sweetness that would come. Once again, Ned did not disappoint as lemon cakes, honey cakes, and sweet sugared waffles were brought out, along with trays upon trays of mugs that contained a very thick and ice-cold mixture of either pink, brown or yellow. While the other platters were placed in strategic areas on the table for everyone to reach, the servants served each lord and lady one personal mug of the new dessert. At the high table, Ned himself got a pink one, while Caitlin and Benjen got brown and yellow respectively, and they each took delicate and wary sips. The concoction was delightful, a cold and creamy dessert that was thick enough to fill the stomach and with plenty of flavor. Murmurs rang across the hall as each of the guests took their own tastes and also wondered at the new delicacy, clearly the gift from Dawn that Mardaily had announced earlier. Calling over the head kitchen servant, Ned asked her to tell everyone what exactly it was. "It is a milkshake, my lords," she replied. "Made with milk, ice and either strawberries, melted chocolate or bananas for the flavor, all whisked and shaken until it froths. Ingenious. Simple, though the ingredients for the flavoring were all grown in the far south and were quite expensive, chocolate especially, but the outcome was quite delicious and would definitely be a hit everywhere in the known world, bringing Dawn plenty of gold as the foremost traders of chocolate and bananas, as well as the north for the ice of course. They only needed 4 news of the new dessert to spread and they would be receiving ravens by the hundreds. Chapter 5. While the Westerlands were well known across Westeros as the richest kingdom due to their extensive gold mines, Dawn had never been very far behind. The great Queen Nymeria had made a wise decision in settling her people in the far south of the continent, as although the climate made it difficult to grow enough crops to feed the entirety of their people, it was perfect to cultivate a multitude of luxury items that were difficult to find anywhere else and therefore ensured the wealth of their kingdom through trade. Cocoa beans, bananas, silks, figs, wine and spices ensured that the Dornish were never left wanting, and as such, though the Dornish had never had a war fleet since Nymeria had burned hers 1,000 years ago, every harbour of the kingdom was filled to the brim with trading and merchant vessels. Their trade had increased even more since the Baratheon king and his lioness wife had taken the throne, and it was well known across the entire realm how fond he was of drink and she was of silk. Only the best was acceptable for the royal family, and at the rate they were buying, Doran wouldn't be surprised if Queen Cersei only wore a dress once before throwing it away, or if King Robert drank himself to death before dawn and the North were ready for a restoration. But the gold flowed in and Dawn was all the better for it. It was this wealth that allowed Prince Oberyn to ensure the safety of the 2 exiled Targaryen children. He had been sending monthly reports back and Doran had to say he was quite pleased with his success, but now the prince was finally coming home, after 2 long years of absence. Doran waited patiently at the docks while the ship transporting his brother slowly approached, sitting in his new wheelchair as a servant held a parasol over his head to protect from the sun. His gout had unfortunately gotten much worse over the past couple of years, and although he could still walk small distances, the chair allowed a refreshing break from the pain. It would continue to get worse, he knew, but he hoped that he still had time to watch as his family got their due from the Lannisters once Jaehaerys was a man grown. The Lions weren't the only ones who paid their debts, Doran thought, and he would ensure they paid theirs in blood, along with that Stag King who reports said was getting fatter and fatter by the day. After what seemed like an eternity, Oberyn's ship finally docked and the gangplank was lowered, allowing the prince to come to shore. He spotted his older brother within seconds and immediately began making his way over, ignoring the others that were disembarking behind him. "Brother," the young prince greeted as he approached. The two embraced affectionately and kissed each other's cheeks before Oberyn leant back and shot a concerned look at the chair. "It is nothing, brother, my gout is simply getting worse as we predicted." Doran answered the unspoken question. His eyes turned back to the ship as more and more people disembarked, raising an eyebrow as a dozen horses were led across the gangplank, followed by 20 or so men wearing leather armor and carrying spears as they marched in pairs. "I'll explain when we get inside," Oberyn explained with a smirk. With a nod, Doran turned and began to lead the way back to the palace, alternating between rolling his chair with the strength of his arms and allowing his brother to push him. The path from the docks to the palace took almost an hour on foot, and once again Doran wished that he didn't have this damned gout that prevented him from riding. Nevertheless, they did get there eventually and servants were called to run a bath for Oberyn and to bring refreshments to the prince's solar. Occupying himself with various letters and reports, Doran waited for another hour before a knock on his door sounded and the guard outside announced the arrival of his brother. Pushing the papers to the side with a sigh of relief, Doran called for his brother to enter. "Well, how did it go? Allow me to pour myself a cup of wine before you interrogate me, brother." Oberyn chuckled, reaching for the pitcher. "It went well. As you know, I found them quite easily, which is concerning given the Stag King's desire to kill them, but they were well guarded. The harder part was convincing Jaehaerys that we had to move the children. He changed his mind when an assassin managed to get into the princess' room during the night. The scoundrel would have succeeded in killing her if she hadn't woken the entire house with her crying. She's a loud one, I tell you. The callousness of that man never ceases to amaze me." Doran replied and the younger man inclined his head in agreement. "I bought a manse in Qohor and we moved last year." "What are they like?" Oberyn leaned back in his chair and took a moment to think. "Daenerys, as I said, is loud, but she is a sweet child. She smiles more often than not and seems to enjoy babbling nonsense to anyone who will listen despite knowing how to talk. Viserys is also sweet and full of life. He enjoys playing games with the servants and chasing cats around the manse. He is, however, prone to massive temper tantrums. More than once I have had to put that boy over my knee." The brothers both pursed their lips in disapproval, a movement they had learned from their mother, but it was known that children could be difficult and proper discipline was important. "And how did everyone react to the knowledge that there is another Targaryen?" "Well, of course I couldn't say much, it is best that we keep Jaehaerys' location a secret, but they were overjoyed. Viserys, especially, was happy to know that he had more family out there, even if that meant that he was no longer the rightful ruler." "Good." Doran nodded and picked at the figs on the platter. "And what of the unexpected cargo you brought with you?" A chuckle sounded as Oberyn crossed his legs and poured himself another cup of wine, prolonging the suspense. "The horses are from Qohor," he began. "Strong war horses that they use in their theater events. I thought that mixed with our sand steeds, our cavalry would be unbeatable. The soldiers are a small portion of the unsullied I bought as protection for the prince and princess before I left. Slaves? The older brother gasped. No, at least not anymore. I bought 100 of them and freed them once they were mine. Most remain in Essos, but I brought 20 back with me to train our future army. The Unsullied are well known for being undefeatable, even the Dothraki hesitate to engage them. That was enough to reassure the ruling prince, and he relaxed into his chair as the room descended into a comfortable silence. A servant entered quickly to replace the pitcher of iced wine with a fresh batch, bringing in strawberry milkshakes to replace the empty fruit platter. Is this the dessert that you wrote to me about? The milkshakes? Oberyn asked as he eyed the thick mixture. Doran, however, was too busy slurping his own mug to answer, and so with a snort, he brought it to his lips. Nice. So what else has been going on here while I was away? Other than the milkshakes, of course. Trade has been booming since the ascent of the Stag King to the throne. Doran responded after a moment. It seems neither he nor his wife understand the concept of restraint, and our coffers have practically doubled due to our sale of silks and wine. I had some people leak the recipe to the milkshakes a while ago, and so the demand for chocolate and bananas has also risen, and I expect the Starks have received many offers for trade of their ice. So financially, all is well, but what of the military? And what of the northern advancements Stark had planned? I have instructed every house in Dorne to double their number of guards and master-at-arms, and weapons production has increased. I'm afraid due to our strained relationship with the throne, we must be subtle in our weapons training. We cannot raise an army without them suspecting us. He paused for a moment to purse his lips once more, less than satisfied at the scrutiny he knew Dorne was under. The north, however, is faring well. Your friends have helped immensely. A canal has been built across the neck to join the western and eastern coasts, and your architect friend has already begun working on rebuilding Moat Cailin, though it will not be complete for a good few years yet. Stark has also ordered the construction of new ships, war galleys that he told the king were to protect their trading ships considering their newfound wealth. And Robert suspects nothing. Doran scoffed. Of course not. Stark is his best friend as far as the king is concerned. He didn't even bat an eyelid when he seemingly forgot to visit King's Landing and give his oaths. The rest of the world is of the same mindset, and besides, the excuse is a plausible one. With the new demand of ice, they will become the targets of pirates sooner or later. Oberyn did not respond, instead leaning back into his chair and staring at his melting milkshake thoughtfully. Doran allowed him his silence while he added some ice chips to his glass of wine, knowing that though brash and easy to anger, his younger brother was perhaps just as smart and cunning as he was. Doran, he finally said, lifting his eyes. I think I have an idea. The small room that held the council meeting in the Red Keep had greatly changed since the days that Aerys had been king. Previously, the walls had been adorned with Targaryen banners, paintings of past kings and tapestries depicting the great fiery slaughter that dragons had brought onto their enemies. Small dragon skulls had adorned the various shelves as decoration, and the primary color of any fabric in the room had been green, to remind everyone of the Mad King's love of wildfire. Now, the room was decked with black and gold, red cushions sat on the chairs around the table, and the paintings had all been replaced to show the great history of the Baratheons. There was even one painting that showed Robert smashing his hammer into Prince Rhaegar at the Trident. The only thing that remained was the tapestries, though they now signified the brutality of the Targaryens of old rather than their glorious victories as it had previously. Not everything had changed, however, Varys thought. The decorations may have been revamped to represent the current king better, but the happenings of the room were the same as always. The positions on the small council had not changed, and even some of the members had remained the same, such as Grand Maester Pycelle and Varys himself. Of course, he was the best spymaster in the realm, so his continued appointment was no surprise, even if he had worked for the Targaryens at one point in his life. The truth was, Varys didn't actually care about the Targaryens, nor did he care about Robert Baratheon. He served the realm, and that was why Aerys had to go. Unfortunately, though no one risked getting burned alive by the king anytime soon, the realm was still not better off under the new monarchs, as they seemed to care more about themselves than those they ruled. Regardless, Varys made his way to his seat at the small council table and waited for the last of the members to arrive. It seemed the masters of coin, Laws and ships had beaten him there and were all huddled together to speak, most likely to share some juicy bit of gossip as these nobles were prone to do. The eunuch had no desire to join them, already knowing all the gossip there was and preferring to keep himself aloof to preserve the air of mystery he had cultivated. Finally, the door opened and the hand of the King Jonarin arrived and stepped inside, followed by a shuffling Pycelle. "Let's get started," Arin intoned, ending all conversation in the room as all the members turned their attention to him. The grizzled man took a deep breath and Varys wondered for a moment how long he would survive in this role, as only after 2 years as hand there were already visible signs of stress in his graying hair. "The king has ordered a tourney for the first name day of Prince Jasper, to be held in 2 months' time." Immediately, the new master of coin opened his ledgers and perused the latest pages with a frown on his face. "Well, it is certainly possible, we have more than enough coin for now for a tourney, though I feel the need to point out that we are spending more than we are earning at the moment, my lord hand," Baelish pointed out, lifting his eyes from the book. I know," Arin responded. "Unfortunately there's nothing we can do to curb expenses. I have already spoken to the king about it and he considers it our responsibility to find ways to ensure the treasury stays healthy." "Has my brother made any suggestions as to the rewards for the winners of the tourney?" Stannis asked, his lips pursed in disapproval. Varys didn't think there was anything that the man did approve of, though in this case it was more than justified. Aerys had been a terrible king, but at least he knew how to count coppers as Robert called it, and the treasury had been full when the rebellion had ended. At this rate it would be empty in 3 years. "He has." Lord Arin sighed again. 20,000 gold dragons to the winner of the joust, 10,000 to the winner of the melee and 5,000 to each runner-up. There was a stunned silence in the room as each of the members took in the figure, and even Varys' mask of congeniality cracked for a moment. You could build an entire castle with 20,000 dragons. Was the man not aware that people died of starvation just a mile from the Red Keep? Of course he wasn't, he couldn't look further than the nearest cup of wine. "Right, well, next order of business," the hand continued awkwardly. "The last of the reparations to the city after the sack have been completed and King's Landing is whole again." "About time," Stannis muttered. "Well, that will be one cost that we won't have to worry about in the future," Baelish commented, and the conversation was slightly sidetracked as each of the members congratulated and complimented each other, momentarily preening at the thought of a job well done. Varys wished they would drown. Lord Varys Arin called, silencing the chatter and once again bringing attention back to the meeting. "Any news on the rumors of?" At that moment, the doors to the council room slammed open, making everyone jump at the noise, to reveal a red-faced King Robert. Poor Pycelle was clutching his heart and breathing deeply to calm his racing heart, and even Varys had closed his eyes for a moment to regain his composure. "Your Grace, welcome." What the fuck is this I hear about the damn Dornish building an army?" the king roared, stomping towards the council table and dropping himself into the empty chair that was always reserved for him, even though this was the first time he deigned to attend a meeting. "I was just about to ask Varys if he had any news on that front, Robert," Arin responded, a warning glare on his face that his former foster son completely ignored. "Well, Varys," answered the man. "Yes, Your Grace," he responded, bowing his head for a moment. "My little birds have told me that these new soldiers are not in fact part of an army, rather an organization not unlike our own gold cloaks that patrol and police the city. A whole 5,000 men in just a few months just to patrol a city." "Not quite, my lord hand. This company will not just be patrolling a city but rather the entirety of Dorne. My little birds have reported that the number is currently at 5,000 men with another 10,000 still in training. After some investigation, it seems Dorne has been subject to numerous bandit and pirate attacks, and as such they have created an armed force to patrol their lands and accompany their goods on trading voyages. So they will not be invading," Arin clarified. "Indeed, nothing has pointed towards an attempt towards the crown, my lord hand." That wasn't entirely true. None of Varys' little birds had reported any concerning movement of this new army of the Dornish, but there had been plenty of suspicious movement involving Dorne. Prince Oberyn disappearing for 2 years to Essos and the Targaryen children across the sea disappearing from Braavos at the same time as he was visiting, as well as the shipment of unsullied soldiers and war horses once he returned to Westeros. Additionally, if he didn't know any better, and of course he didn't know any better, after all what was as it seemed in this world, it would be easy to believe that the suspicious behavior of the Dornish had spread to the north. If one disregarded the supposed close relationship between Robert and Ned Stark, they would believe that the Northerners and the Dornish were working together. The Starks had cut a river across the neck, begun forging trade alliances left and right, started rebuilding Moat Cailin, perhaps the most impenetrable fortress in Westeros, and it was right at the entrance of the North, and the Northern Fleet. All thanks to a trade alliance that they had first set up with the Dornish before it spread to other kingdoms. And Varys was no fool. There may be no clear threat of invasion, but the Martells wanted nothing more than to see Lannister blood on their blades, and that row between Stark and the king after the murders of the princess and her children was a thing of legends. The number of ravens that had been traveling between the North and Dorne was immense, and what's worse is that only recently there had also been a few exchanges of letters between the North and the Reach as well. It couldn't be a coincidence that they were regularly conversing with the only two kingdoms that had fought on the Targaryen side during the rebellion. However, try as he might, he had not managed to catch on of the ravens to the Reach as of yet, and all of those to and from Dorne had been written in the old tongue of the First Men, a language that Varys unfortunately did not know and could not find any books about. Yes, it was clear to Varys that the two kingdoms the furthest away from each other were up to something. However, the thought of the drunkard king and his vain wife was enough to make Varys hesitate in reporting his suspicions to the council. That, and the fact that there was one more secret that was being hidden by the plotters, one piece of the puzzle that Varys knew was missing, but he had no clue as to what it could be. And if there was one thing that Varys hated, it was an incomplete puzzle. "I still don't like it," Robert muttered. "They didn't even give their oaths, and now they amass an army." "Neither did the North, Your Grace." Every head turned towards the silky voice of the Master of Coin, who was not even trying to hide that god's awful smirk of his. The man's hatred of the Starks was well known to Varys, as one of them had gutted him from shoulder to hip and left him on the edge of death, and the other wedded and bedded the woman that Baelish had been fighting for in the first place. "Who the fuck are you?" King Robert asked shortly. "Lord Baelish, Your Grace, Master of Coin, appointed last month." "Baelish. Baelish." The king frowned at the table as he tried to recall the name, and Stannis and Arryn's lips thinned further and further in disapproval. "You, that tax collector from Gulltown?" "Indeed I am, Your Grace," the man responded, bowing his head in a way that to Varys clearly looked mocking, but it seemed no one else had noticed. "Right, well, the North doesn't need to give oaths," Robert dimly responded, slamming his fist on the table as if to bring the point home. "The North answers to Ned, and Ned is my brother in all but blood. He would never dream of raising arms against me." "Yes, Robert, we know that," Arryn responded. "But Baelish does have a point. The Martells aren't the only ones that haven't said their oaths. Ned and the Greyjoys haven't either. We cannot single out Dorne for not coming to bend the knee unless we do the same to the North and the Iron Islands. Varys, are you certain that they do not plan on using this army against us?" "My little bird's reports were quite clear, my Lord Hand." "Then we will let them be," Arryn commanded, and though the king was the foremost authority in the room, he nodded his head after a few moments of hesitation and promptly stormed out in the same fashion that he had first stormed in. Varys contained his chuckle as the group dispersed to attend to their own matters. He was excited to see what the North and Dorne would come up with. Chapter 6. If one was to look at a map of the North, all they would see would be vast, empty land with a few keeps dotted here and there, most of which were ruins like Moat Cailin or the Stony Keep. The largest kingdom in Westeros that had an abundance of fields, rivers, forests and lakes, and yet it all remained unused and undeveloped apart from a few farms. Everything else remained empty. Of course, those were the maps at the Citadel. The one in the Lord's Solar at Winterfell, however, gave quite a different report. Farmland had quadrupled thanks to the irrigation system the Northerners had adopted from Dorne, allowing the North to harvest enough crops to actually feed their people, though of course they would still need to trade with the South for anything that required a warmer climate to grow, but they had managed to reduce their spending on food by 2/3. A canal now cut across the neck, further reducing the cost of any trade from the Reach and the Westerlands. New villages and small towns had cropped up near the Bay of Seals and the Bay of Ice and Carhold. Last Hearth and Bear Island had seen a rise in population as more people moved to where the work was. And most importantly, mines had begun to appear all over the kingdom. The prospectors that had moved north at Prince Oberyn's request had made their sweep of the land and returned within a year as Ned had expected, with reports that told of great wealth beneath their feet. Not as much as one would expect of such a vast and varied land, but it was still there: amber in the caves on Bear Island, emeralds in the rivers of Stony Shore, rubies at Flint Cliffs, marble on Skagos, and finally gold in Long Lake and the White Knife. Almost every house in the north had something on their territory that could be mined, making Ned Stark rise in favor with each of his bannermen, as all he requested was 5% of the profits they all made. So the mines were built and the men got to work excavating the riches, but nothing was traded yet. Instead, they waited for the white ravens of the citadel to be dispatched. Since the leaking of milkshakes by dawn, every other kingdom in West Eos barring the Iron Islands had requested trade with the north, further increasing their wealth, especially once Ned publicized the many other uses of their ice. 3 ships per month were sent to the Reach alone, doubling the monthly revenue of those northern houses involved and kick-starting a regular correspondence of ravens between Lord Stark and the Tyrells of Highgarden as they considered a deeper alliance. Multiple times had Ned turned down betrothal offers for his son and brother, and even one for Jon. The revenue from this trade went towards expanding the ice-cutting villages in the northernmost bays and Lord Stark's many projects. Already, the canal was completed, Moat Cailin was a third of the way done, 30 war galleys had been built at White Harbour and the mines had been set up. Those lords who received payment from the ice trade, the Starks included, had repaired, renovated and expanded their castles and towns, and Ned did have to admit that some of the money was spent on frivolities: new dresses for Catelyn, statues and paintings to decorate Winterfell, new books for the library and more southern fruits with their meals. But all of that trade stopped once winter came, almost 3 years after the end of the rebellion, as the weather turned too cold for the icy deserts the South loved so much. Ice was only needed for preservation and medicinal purposes, and surprisingly, this only encompassed a fifth of their usual sales. That was when the northern lords began trading their gold and gems, negating any loss of revenue they may have experienced. Once again, trading ships flocked to White Harbour to deliver gold in exchange for jewels, but their greatest hit by far was the marble from Skagos. Once the king demanded a great marble statue of himself holding his hammer, all of the southern lords needed to emulate him, and the beautiful stone was shipped in droves. That winter was perhaps the least difficult in history. More food in their stores, more gold in their coffers and renovated castles ensured that everyone was kept safe from the cold and starvation that usually plagued the north during winter. Even the small folk was safe, as Winterfell had more than enough coin to go around, and any struggling peasant was welcome to petition the Starks for aid without worrying about paying it back later. What kind of lord would I be if I allowed my people to die when there is so much I can do to prevent it? Lord Stark would say. Yes, Ned Stark was dedicated to his people and his land, but his ultimate goal was the return of the Kings of Winter and the restoration of the Targaryens on the Iron Throne, which was why just a few months into winter, after a whole year of trading ravens with the Tyrells of the Reach, he traveled south to meet with them in person, leaving Benjen as the Stark in Winterfell to look after Robb and Jon. There had been plenty of deliberation and hesitation, numerous ravens between Ned and the Martells on whether they should include the Tyrells on their plans or not, and more ravens between the North and the Reach to sound them out. Considering the number of betrothal offers Mace Tyrell had sent, it was safe to assume that they were willing to enter into an alliance, even if Ned had turned down each offer. So it was agreed with Doran that the sooner the Tyrells were told of their plans the better, lest they grow some loyalty for the new Baratheon dynasty, but it had to be done in person. Prince Oberyn was already a guest of Highgarden by the time Ned arrived and had made a few allusions to their plans, but it was agreed that they would wait until all parties were present before exposing the full plan. Highgarden was certainly impressive. Great white walls and shining towers, the castle was one of 3 that Brandon the Builder Stark had built, and it was an absolute beauty. As one of the southernmost kingdoms of West Eos, the Reach was hardly affected by winter and the climate was similar to a northern summer, allowing crops to continue growing and the famous castle gardens to continue blooming with beautiful flowers. Ned and his party were welcomed warmly and taken through the bountiful orchards and even past a large marble fountain on their way to the castle, where they were each given luxurious rooms and left alone to refresh themselves after a long trip. Once he had bathed and changed, A servant led Ned to the gardens where he was welcome to explore, as he had been advised that he would not be meeting in private with Mace Tyrell until the next day. For over an hour, Ned ambled through the gardens, admiring the wonderfully maintained flower beds and the beautifully carved marble statues and fountains, occasionally taking a seat on the benches to just take in the artwork. He would need to commission some sculptors for Winterfell, he thought, as Catelyn would love some of this artwork in her home. Suddenly, a small cough brought him out of his reverie. "Is this seat taken?" Turning, Ned was surprised to see Olenna Tyrell stood next to him, gesturing to the bench he was sat on with her cane. "No, of course not. Please take a seat, my lady," he responded, standing to show respect as the old woman sat herself down. "Lord Stark, I presume?" Lady Tyrell asked, peering at him intently. Ned nodded once before she continued. "Yes, Mace has been in an absolute tizzy since he received your raven announcing your visit. He has been quite eager to meet you, and I must admit to the same. You honor me, my lady." "Posh!" Olenna scoffed, adjusting her grip on her cane as she frowned. "Don't get all flowery on me, Lord Stark, I have enough of that here. Show me some of that bluntness you Northerners are known for. Now, tell me how you managed to increase the standing and wealth of the North so much when all your ancestors failed." Ned allowed himself a small smile before he responded. "Even in the North, they know of you, my lady. The Queen of Thorns they call you." "Bah! Hardly. I'm just an old woman tired of wasting time with false politeness and too useless to be considered worth punishing if I speak out of turn." "I would hardly call you useless, Lady Olenna. In fact, many see you as the only useful Tyrell there is." This drew a chuckle from the old woman. "Well, I may agree, but all the same, best not to mention that in front of my son. Now answer the question," she ordered. "There is not much to say, I'm afraid." Ned shrugged. "Many of my forefathers had the same ideas as I, and this is not the first time that there is an attempt at rebuilding Moat Cailin. The only thing they lacked was coin, which you have plenty of thanks to a resource you have had in abundance right outside your home for millennia." The Northerner conceded. "But you must understand that in the North, the cold and ice is such a part of life that we often forget that you don't have it in the South. I got the idea of trading ice when I was in the deserts of Dawn, and I'm sure my ancestors would have had the same idea as I. Alas, none of them ever traveled that far south." "Ah yes. When you were rushing to save the sister Rhaegar Targaryen kidnapped and most likely raped. So tell me, why is it that you wish to see a Targaryen restoration?" Whipping his head around to look at his companion, Ned had to suppress the shiver of rage at the lie. All throughout the realm it was believed that Lyanna had been taken against her will, and only the Martells and Starks knew otherwise, something he planned to rectify when the time came to take the throne for his nephew. What concerned him the most, however, was her knowledge of his plans. "How do you know that?" he growled, causing his companion to laugh loudly. "Young man, I am not an idiot, nor am I deaf. Prince Oberyn has been prancing around the place for the last 2 weeks implying that a Targaryen will once again sit on the throne to any Tyrell he passes. And considering your close relationship with Dawn and the constant stream of ravens between you two, it's safe to assume that whatever plans he is alluding to, you also have a part in." Damn the man, Ned thought. Sure, Olenna Tyrell was one of the most astute and intelligent women in Westeros, but it wouldn't take much for someone else to come to the same conclusion she had, increasing the chance of their plots being uncovered by Varys and reported back to the king. "And where might I find Prince Oberyn?" Lord Stark asked, a frown on his face. "Oh, somewhere in the castle, or perhaps at a brothel. No way to be certain. But there is no need to worry, his allusions and implications were quite obscure. I doubt anyone else will be able to put the pieces together." Lady Olenna responded. "Good. I don't wish for that to change, so I would ask that you wait until tomorrow's meeting before asking your questions." The old woman nodded her head once, a slight smirk on her face as Ned's reaction confirmed her theory. Though she would have to wait another day to get all of her answers, she at least knew their endgame, and it was one that she could fully get behind. The Targaryens had done much for the Tyrells in the past, and though there had been quite a few bad eggs in the lot, many of the past kings had been great. Greater than this Baratheon stag at least. The Northern Lord stood and took his leave with a few words of goodbye, leaving Olenna to her own thoughts and plots. "Welcome, welcome, my lords. Lord Tyrell crowed as he gestured with his arm for Prince Oberyn and Lord Stark to enter the solar, where he and his mother were already waiting with a platter full of sticky honey cakes and a pitcher of arbor gold. The previous evening had been quite uneventful, Ned having chosen to take his meal in his rooms before going straight to bed. That morning, however, he and Oberyn had taken a walk in the gardens to go over their plan one last time before the meeting with the Tyrells, and Ned had taken advantage to chastise the slightly older prince for his less than discreet words during his stay so far. Or at least, he had attempted to chastise the man, but Oberyn did not seem to feel the slightest bit of remorse, as evidenced by his great smirk as he strode into the solar and took a seat in one of the offered chairs, pouring himself a cup of wine as he did so. Ned was slightly more serious, striding over to the desk to shake Lord Tyrell's hand and kiss Lady Olenna's with a grimness to his face that could only be pulled off by a northerner. "Lord Stark, how wonderful to meet you finally." "And the same to you, of course, Prince Oberyn," Mace said as he took a seat, a great smile adorning his face. "Likewise, Lord Tyrell." Ned nodded. "I must say, I have been most impressed with your work in the north, Lord Stark, most impressed indeed. Though you most likely surmised that in our ravens, did you not?" "I did indeed, hence our presence here today," the northerner responded, eager to get to business. "Alas, it was not to be." "Yes, I have been watching quite closely. That canal. Goodness, I can't believe no one thought of it before," Lord Tyrell continued. "It has made life much easier for the Reach. Even with that toll of yours, the costs of trading with the Eastern Kingdoms has greatly reduced. And Prince Oberyn, oh, those milkshakes are absolutely wondrous. You simply must tell me how you managed to create such a thing." "I'm afraid I had nothing to do with the matter, my lord," Prince Oberyn replied, his ever-present smirk still adorning his face. "I was in Essos at the time looking into the welfare of some of our allies." No matter," the Reachman continued, unaware of the other's growing impatience. "And tell me, Lord Stark, is it true that—" "Oh, enough of this nonsense," Lady Olenna snapped, banging her cane on the ground and bringing a smile to the faces of their guests while her son looked at her in shock. "Tell me about this Targaryen restoration." "Mother," Mace gasped. "Oh, be quiet, boy, we're in a secure area and I've had the entire floor checked for spies and cleared of servants. Our guests didn't travel all this way just to make small talk. Now, Lord Stark pretty much confirmed my theory yesterday, but tell me, what is your plan and why should we help you?" "Mother." Lord Mace's horrified speech was cut off before it could even start as Prince Oberyn finally let loose the laugh that had been bubbling in his throat since the fat flower began speaking. Even Ned had a small smile on his face at the old woman's antics. Clearly, she was not one to mince words or waste precious time on niceties, just as she had said the day before in the gardens. She would do well in the north, Ned thought. "Lady Olenna is correct, Lord Tyrell," Oberyn began. "We are here to seek an alliance with the Reach with the ultimate goal of declaring the North independent once again and placing a Targaryen on the Iron Throne." The two Tyrells seemed quite gobsmacked for a moment before their shocked expressions were replaced by thoughtful ones. "An independent North is a surprise," Lady Olenna remarked. "And the Targaryens will never accept it. There's not much they can do to prevent it without their dragons, and as you've all noticed, the North is quite prepared for an invasion," Ned responded. "Moat Cailin, the Northern Fleet?" Mace asked. "Yes, not to mention the neck is its own defense, and there is now a canal that reinforces that. But it will not come to that. I already know that the Targaryens will not protest this decision. Prince Oberyn, you mentioned a moment ago you were on a trip to Essos to visit with some allies. May I assume that these allies you speak of are the exiled Viserys and Daenerys Targaryen, and they have agreed to allow this?" the Queen of Thorns questioned, leaning forward on her chair. "I did indeed visit with the Targaryens across the sea," the Dornishman responded, slowly swirling his wine as his smirk grew. "But they had nothing to do with this. They will have to follow the will of Rorgazé when it comes to the north. And I can confirm that he will see no problem in allowing them their independence. Though just for clarification, we plan on separating the north from the Iron Throne before we put the Targaryens back on it." "Rorgazé," Lord Tyrell repeated, a frown on his face as he stared at the prince. But suddenly, he was interrupted by a loud gravelly laugh from his mother. She had thrown her head back and was clutching her cane tightly as Mace looked on in concern, and their guests smiled as they realized that she had put the pieces together. "Eddard Stark, you rascal!" "Mother! Lyanna Stark!" the old woman choked out, still giggling like a girl. It took Mace a few moments to understand what she was implying, but once he did, his head swiveled back towards Ned with shock on his face. "Lord Stark, to have the future king as your ward is a great thing for your plans, of course, but we all suspected, but to have it proved by the birth of a child. Lord Stark, I am so sorry to hear of the trials your sister—" "Oh, shut up, you oaf!" Olenna chastised, finally calming herself enough to take a few deep breaths. "Lord Stark was quite offended yesterday when I mentioned Prince Rhaegar's crimes against his sister. Care to explain?" Ned took a moment to gather his thoughts and send a quick prayer to the gods as he convinced himself to speak and once again risk breaking his promise to his dear sister. But he was too far gone now. Your thoughts are right, Lady Olenna," he confirmed before turning towards Lord Tyrell. "My sister was not kidnapped, nor was she raped. She ran away with the prince after they fell in love to escape her marriage to King Robert. They married in the eyes of the old gods, and their son is the true heir to the Iron Throne." There was silence in the room as the hosts assimilated this new information, Mace opening and closing his mouth in astonishment and Olenna smirking in satisfaction that she had been the first to catch on. Until Lord Tyrell finally took a deep breath to speak. "Jaehaerys Targaryen, currently known as Jon Snow, bastard son of Brandon Stark." Prince Oberyn answered the unasked question. "A bastard? You are passing off the rightful king as a bastard?" "Oh, be quiet, Mace, it's a great idea," Olenna scolded. "The boy will be invisible, beyond suspicion. It was well known that Brandon Stark liked chasing skirts, and him having a bastard is no surprise. And with all these renovations that Lord Stark is doing, it would be no surprise if he were to one day give his bastard nephew a keep of his own, allowing Jaehaerys to attend the lordly lessons along with the Stark heir without people asking questions. Yes, this will get him the training needed to be king, and the anonymity to live long enough to actually claim the throne. That was our thinking," Prince Oberyn commented, throwing a smile the old woman's way. "Very well." Lord Tyrell ceded. "You have explained your goal, and your plan on how to achieve this goal is quite evident with all of the work going on in the north and with Dorne's new army. Now explain why we should help you." "We had hoped to marry our Margaery to the prince so that she will one day be queen. Why should we change our plans now? Other than the fact that you have referred to Jaehaerys as the rightful king twice now," Prince Oberyn retorted, raising an eyebrow as Mace blushed. "Well, you say that you wish to marry your daughter to the future king, but there is currently no Baratheon prince since Jasper died when winter came. With our plan, you would have 2 living princes to choose from. Lord Stark has refused any betrothal offers on the grounds that his children will be the ones to make the decision on their spouses. I doubt it would be any different for his ward and nephew." Yes, the Dornishman agreed. "However, he has agreed to foster my niece Arianne in Winterfell when they are older. I am sure a similar agreement can be made for Margaery." "Indeed," Lord Stark intoned. "I would consider fostering as an alternative to betrothals until the boys are of age to reinforce our alliance." The Tyrells were going to agree, they all knew it. All that was left was to hash out the details of the alliance, what each member would gain. The meeting was paused for an hour as they went in search of some food, as Lady Olenna had dismissed all the servants on that floor before the meeting began, and no mention of any of their discussions were made while they were out of the room. A short walk in the gardens later to digest and allow the servants to clean and tidy the solar and refill the food platter and pitcher of wine, and the group was once again sat around the spacious desk in Lord Tyrell's solar. After 3 more hours of talk, it was ultimately decided that Willers Tyrell would foster in Winterfell with Lord Stark for a period of 3 years, and that once Margaery turned 12, she would foster with the Mormonts on Bear Island for 2 years, at which point she would return to Highgarden with Jon, so that he could begin his fostering of 4 years. It was argued that the South would never accept a Northern king, especially if the North was going to be a whole separate nation, and that Jon needed to spend as much time as possible in the South. Jon would remain at Highgarden for 2 years before going to Dorne for his remaining 2 years, allowing both Margaery Tyrell and Arianne Martell to get to know him in the hopes that he would choose one of them as his bride. Additionally, any toll from the canal would be erased for any ships from Dawn and the Reach, and any food coming from the Reach would be cheaper for the other two kingdoms. When the time eventually came, they would have 3 armies, as well as the impressive Dawnish cavalry and the fleets from the north and the Reach to secure their victory. With a shake of hands, the members of the new alliance sealed their agreement, each satisfied with what the future would hold. Chapter 7. In the days when Quayan Greyjoy ruled the Iron Islands, reaving had been outlawed. The ancient tradition of claiming the Iron Price became punishable by death, and all raiding, raping and pillaging stopped in his quest to build a closer relationship with the other kingdoms of Westeros and to earn a name for himself in the history books. His plan failed, as unfortunately none of the Greenlanders were willing to overlook centuries of violence, and all he succeeded in doing was alienating and impoverishing his people, as the Iron Islands were famous for being a completely barren set of rocky islands that only had iron to trade. Thankfully, his reign didn't last long, as he had ascended to the Seastone chair already an old man and had died barely a decade later, leaving his seat to his son Balon just a few years before Robert's rebellion. Unlike his father, Balon did not care about being liked by the Greenlanders. On the day of his formal ascent to the lordship of the Iron Islands in front of all of his vassals, Balon announced the independence of the islands from the Iron Throne and his new title as king, and promised the return of their glory days where Westeros would fear the sight of any ship adorning the Kraken sigil on its sails, where they would take food, coin and women to their heart's desire, and where they would prosper like they had before the time of his cowardly father. But first, he had said, quieting the cheers from his vassals, we must build our strength. We will train our men, we will build our fleet, and most importantly, we will bide our time. No Greenlander will know of our intentions until they see our fleet on their shores. And so the Iron Islands closed themselves off from the rest of the world. The few trading ships Quayan had dispatched were docked and burned. No Iron Islander was allowed off the islands without Balon's permission, and any Greenlander mad enough to step foot on their shores was put to death. Balon's brothers Euron and Victorian were given command of their remaining 50 longships and tasked with looting Essos of any wealth they could find to sustain the citizens of the islands until it was time to make their move, though they were ordered to stay far away from Westeros seashores. That had been the best day of Roderick Greyjoy's life until now. He had been 9 at the time, and after many long years of building and training and practicing in Essos, it was finally time to make their mark on the world and take what was theirs. As heir to King Balon, he had been given his own command of 50 longships and the 5,000 men they carried, and as his small fleet made its way north in the dead of night, Roderick could barely contain his excitement. Of course, he had commanded raids on the smaller port towns of Essos and Sotorios, but those were nothing when faced with this new task. For 6 years, the North had been growing in wealth, and even the Mormonts of Bear Island, previously the poorest house in Westeros, was now wealthy even by southern standards thanks to their contributions to the ice trade and the amber that lay in their caves. And it would all be theirs. Brought out of his thoughts by the arrival of a presence beside him, Roderick turned and nodded a greeting to his uncle and namesake Lord Harlaw. The man was tall and gruff, though the young Greyjoy had always thought his uncle would look fiercer if only he let his beard grow out. Instead, the man insisted on shaving once a week, never letting his facial hair grow beyond stubble. Roderick, Lord Harlaw greeted. We will arrive at Bear Island shortly before dawn, as expected. Good. I don't want the bears to know what is coming for them until we smash their doors in. The older man was quiet for a moment as he regarded his nephew, who ignored his gaze to instead focus on the horizon, where their destination was. The men tell me you plan to attack the castle first. Harlaw finally said. That's right. Roderick responded, still refusing to look away from the sea. Are you mad? This finally moved the young captain, as he swiveled towards his uncle in shock. The amber mines are on the northern part of the island, most likely with no guards to be found, yet you want to dock at the castle, where we will have to get past soldiers, guards and the castle walls to reach any wealth whatsoever. The castle is where the coffers are and where the riches are brought once they are mined, replied Roderick. It is by far the wealthiest part of the island, and I didn't come here just to steal some scraps. Besides, if history has taught us anything, it's that with all our men, the Bear Islanders won't stand a chance against us, and it will hardly be a challenge at all getting through those castle walls. The elder scoffed. You clearly didn't pay much attention to your lessons. What history taught us is that Bear Islanders were fierce and raiding them was a challenge even back when they had shitty defenses. You would know, wouldn't you, Reader? The Greyjoy sneered. Lord Roderick Harlaw had earned the moniker of Reader during Quayen's days. Unlike most other lords, he had been happy to stop the raiding and to try at peace with the Greenlanders. He had even gone so far as to study at the Citadel for a year. Most forgot, however, that though he didn't enjoy raiding and pillaging, he was damn good at it, and it was prowess on a ship that had earned him a command of his own even before he had gained the lordship of High Harlaw. He was smart and experienced in the way of the iron price, and very few of his raids had failed back in the old days, but that no longer seemed to matter. Ignoring the barb, he continued in his lecture. Do you honestly think that in the 6 years the Mormonts have been building their wealth, that they have just allowed it to rot in their coffers? I'm telling you, when we get there you can expect stronger walls and more guards and soldiers than what the history books tell us. Bear Island is no longer the poorest house in Westeros, and you can expect that to reflect in their defenses. Uncle, Bear Island has not been the subject of raids in almost 20 years now. They will never expect us, and with winter just having ended and the cover of night, they will be weak and we will have the advantage. You will get us all killed. If you say so. Roderick shrugged. However, I am captain of this fleet and therefore that is my prerogative. Seeing that he was getting nowhere, Lord Harlaw threw his hands in the air and stalked away to check on the men and equipment, cursing foolish Greyjoys as he went. He was interrupted, however, when a shout sounded overhead. Land! The cry had every man not holding an oar rushing to the prow of the ship to catch a glimpse of their destination, and sure enough, after a few minutes, small flickers of light could be seen in the distance, likely indicating the presence of guards at the top of the castle ramparts. Ha! Roderick Greyjoy laughed as they got closer, the fires becoming more distinguishable until each torch could be seen separately rather than just as one blurry line. There's barely 20 torches. See, uncle, they are as weak as ever. Men! The reader shouted, ignoring his nephew in favor of organizing the fighters. To your stations. Arm yourselves. Similar cries rang out on the nearby ships, all of them having caught sight of the island they were about to raid, and the noise alerted the guards on the walls of the castle, who began issuing their own commands. Only 200 feet away from shore, the raiders were armed and ready. The Ironborn had sailing down to an art. Their ships were crafted with the express purpose of being fast and easy to control, and they were built low to allow the raiders to jump over the side rather than having to lower a gangplank, all with the purpose of surprising the enemy. Getting in, wreaking havoc and getting out was their goal. Just as the ships were about to get close enough for the men to jump, the fires on the ramparts multiplied as the torches were lowered into large oil basins, illuminating the castle clearly. Roderick Harlaw was right. The old wooden walls of his memory had been replaced with a great granite structure, complete with watchtowers and shields at the top that covered the archers stationed there, and their number had also quadrupled since the old days, now totaling around 200 men. The 20 torches that had lit the wall previously were just a ruse, and though the Bear Islanders couldn't have possibly known about the attack, they were prepared. None of this mattered to the captain. Charge! The young Greyjoy screamed, leaping from the side of the boat to land in knee-high water. Following the lead of their captain, 5,000 men including Lord Harlaw jumped with their own war cries. For Pike! For King Balon! What is dead may never die. As soon as they stepped foot in the water, however, the archers let loose their arrows and Ironborn began falling even before they had stepped foot on the beach. Simultaneously, the great ironwood gates to the castle opened and more soldiers streamed out in perfect formation and lined themselves at the foot of the walls. More and more came, armed with swords, axes and maces and wearing shining armor adorned with the Mormont's bear sigil as the raiders trudged through the onslaught of arrows. The trek up the hill was arduous, and even though the castle was only 100 feet from the shore, it took the attackers almost a full minute to reach the awaiting defending army. A minute during which almost 1,000 Ironborn fell while the last of the soldiers had streamed out of the now closed castle gate. The arrows stopped once the two forces met to avoid the guards hitting their own people, but that didn't make the fight any less lethal, nor did they stay idle. Sounds of steel against steel rang out as Ironborn met Bear Islander, the two groups hacking away viciously at one another. This was no song and this was no honorable duel. Men fought for their lives and did anything to ensure they kept fighting, maces to the balls, swords to the tendons, elbows to faces. It was absolute chaos and soldiers and raiders alike were falling like flies. Slowly but surely, however, the attackers were being pushed back down the hill, towards their ships that the archers had targeted with flaming arrows. Out of the 50 that had docked, 10 had sunk or were in the process of sinking, and another 15 had sufficient damage that it would be impossible to sail them all the way back to Pike, leaving only half of their ships in good condition if they needed to retreat. "Kill them all!" Roderick screamed. "Let them feel the Kraken's wrath." Greyjoy. The furious bellow sounded across the beach, louder than even the sounds of dying men and clashing weapons. The young captain whirled around, trying to find the source of the voice, and managed to duck just in time to avoid a morning star to his face. Lifting his head up once again, Roderick snarled at the sight of the warrior before him. "I have waited my entire life for this opportunity," he yelled. "You won't ruin this for me now." "That makes 2 of us," Mage Mormont replied, swinging her weapon once again. The she-bear wore shining armor with her house's bear sigil but no helmet, broadcasting her identity to everyone around as her dark hair blew in the wind. She wasn't the only woman among the soldiers, as over a quarter of the defending force were women hell-bent on protecting their homes and their freedom, including her own mother and 2 eldest daughters. Bear and Kraken faced off, dancing around each other and trading blows, completely blind to the rest of the battle as she wielded a morning star in one hand and a sword in the other while he carried a 2-handed battle axe. The two were fairly matched, until finally Mage was able to smash her morning star into his hand at the same time as he struck a kick to her abdomen. Mage fell back to the floor and Roderick screamed, dropping his weapon to cradle his shattered and torn hand to his chest. He did not see it coming when another soldier approached, sword raised with the intent of finishing the Greyjoy off before a dagger sliced through his neck, felling him before he could even approach the wounded Kraken. Suddenly, as he was about to fall to his knees in pain, a pair of arms circled his waist and held him up. "Uncle!" the young man murmured, too weak to make himself heard over the sound of the battle. "Retreat!" Lord Harlaw screamed, leading the way back to their remaining ships while holding his nephew upright. A few men were too slow to make it back to the ships and were either chased down by Mormont soldiers or struck by arrows, but within a few minutes the Ironborn had managed to make it back to their boats and sailed away, leaving the victorious Bear Islanders to watch as they fled, leaving their dead on the beach and the sea on fire from the broken and burning ships. "Papa!" Conversation was interrupted as the door slammed open and a little girl burst in, running around the large desk on her tiny legs and throwing herself at her father. "Sansa, love!" Ned Stark laughed, diverting his attention from his son and nephew as he bent to pick his daughter up. "What are you doing here, my sweet?" "Wanted to see you," the child responded, placing a hand on her father's cheek. "And where is your mother?" The bright smile disappeared from the little redhead's face and she crumpled her brows. "Mama want to make me nap. I'm not tired." At that moment, the occupants of the room turned back to the door as it burst open once again, revealing a panting and red-faced Lady Catelyn. Robb and Jon exchanged a glance and muffled their giggles at the sight of the ruffled woman, her hair all out of place from running through the corridors. "Sansa! I have told you not to disturb your father when he is in his solar," she scolded, roughly taking the girl from Ned's arms. "No mama, no. I'm sorry, Ned," Catelyn said, ignoring her daughter's wails. "It was no trouble, I was just teaching them about the books." Her husband responded with a smile, gesturing to the multiple ledgers containing the financial files of Winterfell that were strewn across the desk. "Sansa, love," he called, smiling when she quieted and turned her attention back to him. "Do as your mother says and I will get you an orange for dessert, how's that?" "Orange?" "Yes, my sweet, an orange." "A whole one?" "Half of one, all right." "A whole one." The boys giggled once again as the pair negotiated and the great Lord Stark pretended he could refuse anything his daughter asked of him. "Sure enough," Ned sighed and nodded. "All right, a whole one." He finally agreed and the little girl squealed in victory. "But only if you are good for your mother for the rest of the day, you hear? She shouldn't have to run around the castle looking for you in her condition." "Yes Papa, I promise Mama." Sansa turned kissed her mother's cheek, gently patting the slightly swollen belly. It had been a delight when Lady Catelyn had announced just a few months prior that she was with child for the 3rd time, and Ned had immediately turned into the most protective man on the planet. As soon as the announcement was made, he ordered plenty of bed rest and hired more servants to care for his wife and to take over some of her duties. The only reason she wasn't completely confined to her bed was because both she and the maester had argued against it, the maester claiming that exercise was important during the first few months to ensure a healthy baby, and Ned had grudgingly accepted that he was maybe overreacting, just like he had when Caitlin was pregnant with Sansa. Most likely if there were to be more children later, he would have to be explained all of this again, but it ended Caitlin to her husband even more to know how much he genuinely loved her and their family. Finally, having managed to calm the girl down, Caitlin took her leave after placing a gentle kiss on her husband's cheek, much to the disgust of the young boys in the room. "You know," Ned began, a teasing smile on his face as he turned to the two boys. "You both will be married one day." "No, we won't," Rob cried. "Girls are stupid." "Yeah. And I'm going to foster away where there are no girls so I don't have to marry." A sharp laugh sounded from Ned as Jon spoke. "What makes you think there won't be any girls in Highgarden or Dorne?" he asked. "Why does Jon get to foster and I don't?" The question brought Ned up short, as the teasing and humorous atmosphere faded away at Rob's words. The young boy was frowning at the table, lip trembling slightly as he played with the hem of his shirt. At only 6 years old, neither boy really understood why they had to be sent away from home at any point, and though the prospect was quite exciting for Jon, it seemed Rob was not looking forward to being left alone at Winterfell. "You can foster away too, Rob, if you'd like," Ned answered, peering closely at his son. "Really?" "Of course. Though you would have to foster with the Northern House since you will be Lord Paramount after me." "Yeah, and you can make loads of friends with other lords and when you grow up, you'll be the best lord of Winterfell, 'cause everyone'll love you," Jon added, putting an arm around his cousin. "And that way you can run away from the girls like me." The young redhead boy giggled a little before pinching Jon. "Silly. Mother says we have to marry when we grow up, 'cause we have to make alliances and fall in love and have kids for the future of Winterfell." Rob responded, a small smile returned to his face. "No, I won't," the other boy claimed loudly. "I'm a bastard so I don't have to marry." "What? Who told you that?" asked Ned, his face twisted in concern. "One of Auntie Caitlin's maids," Jon responded innocently. "She said that since I was a bastard, no one would want to marry me, but that's good news if you ask me." "Jon." Lord Stark rose from his seat and circled the desk to come and kneel by his nephew's side, taking a hand in his and staring at him intently. "You may have been born out of wedlock, but you are worth no less than any of us. You may not carry our name but you are no less a Stark than Rob, and you will allow no one to say otherwise, do you understand? You will point out this maid to me next time you see her and if anyone else mentions your status to you, you will come and tell me." "Yes, uncle." "Why would anyone treat Jon differently just because his parents weren't married?" asked Rob. Ned sighed and prepared to have the difficult conversation with his boys, but was thankfully saved by the door slamming open for the third time in less than 10 minutes. This time it was Maester Lewin that burst uninvited into the solar, panting and red-faced as Lady Caitlin had done just before. His eyes, however, held a panic that immediately had Ned on alert and standing to attention, his son and nephew completely forgotten. "Maester Lewin, what is it?" he demanded. "My lord. There's been an attack." "Ravens." The poor Maester closed his eyes and took a few breaths to calm himself before trying again. "Ravens have arrived, my lord, from Bear Island and Flint's Finger. Both have been subject to raids from the Ironborn." "What?" Lord Stark gasped. "Casualties." "What is the damage?" "Bear Island managed to hold the attackers off and they only made it as far as the beach, though over 1,000 warriors perished in the attack, but the Flints didn't fare as well," Lewin explained. "There is damage to the castle itself and multiple villages have been burned down. A year's worth of food was stolen, one of the coffers vaults completely emptied of its 3,000 gold dragons and just over 50 young women have gone missing, presumed taken. There was also heavy loss of life, though they fought back fiercely." Rob and Jon were staring wide-eyed at the adults as the news was announced, never having known such violence before. Ned turned pale at the losses for a moment before his brows furrowed in anger and his fists balled together at his sides. "Send ravens to every holdfast in the north," he thundered. "I'm calling the banners. Request aid from Dorne and the Reach, and inform King Robert of my intent to declare war on the Iron Islands." I will drag the Greyjoys out of their caves by their hair and I will eviscerate every single one of them if it's the last thing I do. My lord. What? Lord Stark was already halfway to his desk when Mayor Stillowin called for his attention once more, swiveling around so fast his hair flew into his face, but the young boys were sat too shocked to laugh at the man's ridiculous expression. There were more ravens, my lord. Old Town was also attacked, as was Lannisport, and King Robert has also called his banners. War on the Iron Islands has already been declared and the lords are to meet him at Riverrun with as many men as they can muster. Good. Ned nodded. If there was one thing you could count on Robert for, it was war. After all, the rebels hadn't chosen him as their king over 6 years ago because he was particularly charismatic, but because in matters of war, there was no better than he. Boys. Go get your mother and let her know what has happened and ask her to bring Sir Roderick here. I have letters to the Northern Lords and King Robert to write and an army to gather. The boys in question nodded and sped out of the room, racing each other to find the Lady Catelyn while Lord Stark and Mayor Stillowin sat themselves at the large desk and gathered quills, ink and parchment. Gathering thousands of men was not easy work, and they were already behind. 4 separate attacks, all over the western coast of the country, with likely more to come. Time was of the essence and the Northern Army needed to get to Riverrun as soon as possible. Chapter 8. Hello everyone. Thank you so much for all the follows and favorites and especially all the reviews. I'm so happy with the positive response that this story has gotten. I have added a few things to my profile, namely my goals in regards to updates and posts. Additionally, as stated on my profile, if anyone has any requests regarding the story, please feel free to contact me and I'll let you know if it's possible. Already requested was the inclusion of the Company of the Rose from Essos, the migration of the wildlings south of the wall and a Robb/Margaery pairing. Regarding the first, this was something that I had not thought about but will definitely be included, so shout out to 246 Villy for that suggestion. The Free Folk will indeed be heading south, but I'm not quite decided on the timeline and this may not be included in this story but rather the sequel. Finally, regarding Robb/Margaery, it is one of my preferred ships, however I am not 100% decided yet and in any case, I do want to keep ships a surprise. Additionally, I just wanted to shout out a few authors as well because their fics are the ones that inspired me to write this and that made me want to improve my writing. I used to have a different profile with more fics, you do not want to read them, they were awful. Please everyone check out The Mountains Range by Th Passionate Admiral, sign to Gregor Clegane who actively works to improve Westeros. An epic length fic that I have honestly read like 6 times and my inspiration for the whole Elia/Rhaegar/Lyanna situation and the Northern/Dornish friendship, and Dragonstone by Dany Vat. Robert just showers Ned and his family with presents because of their argument over the Targaryens. My inspiration for the whole Ned/Robert feud. Sorry for the long note, thank you all for your patience, I hope you enjoy the rest of the story. Happy Smiley. The massive fortress that loomed before them had been visible across the plains for hours, and all anyone in the procession could talk about was how large and formidable it was and how quickly it had been built. Oh, it was nowhere near done of course, but the sight of it was still enough to take the men's breath away. Moat Cailin stood proud and tall, the large 7-story keep made of dark stone encasing a pristine courtyard completed. The insides were bare of course, no furniture, no decorations, and no glass adorning the windows, however looking from outside one could be forgiven for thinking that no more work was left to do on the main castle. The outer walls however were another matter. Before its destruction, the great edifice had been surrounded by 20 towers, all linked together by thick and sturdy walls, completely impregnable and indestructible if not for the existence of the dragons that had originally destroyed the northern holdfast almost 3 centuries previously. As the Northern Army made their way south towards Riverrun, only the 2 topmost floors of the keep were visible over the incomplete walls, and Ned rejoiced at the progress that had been made. After 5 years of construction, they were just over halfway through, with the final plans having the walls reach 10 stories tall and the 20 towers reach another 5 floors higher. This would be one of the largest forts on the continent, made to house not only a lord's family and household, but also the thousands of soldiers that would patrol the northern borders. Only Harrenhal, a ruin that had also fallen victim to the Targaryens' conquest of Westeros, and Casterly Rock, a castle built upon and within a great cliff, could ever hope to hold a candle against Moat Cailin once it was complete. Hundreds of men milled around the construction like ants, rushing to and fro, carrying materials either by hand or by cart, lifting great rocks larger than any of them through the use of pulleys that Master Delorme had introduced, and almost the same amount of men milled around the sea of tents that had cropped up around the castle. This was just a skeleton crew, Lord Stark knew, and somewhere among them hid another 1,000 men, dressed in their furs and armor, carrying their belongings on their back as they prepared to join the war effort. The gates to the fortress had already been installed, and a small path that led to the King's Road had been beaten to allow easier passage for the incoming carts full of materials imported from the various northern lands that were aiding in the construction effort. The canal was not far either, just 100 yards north of where Kaelin's path and the King's Road joined together, a good source of income for the future lord of the castle. It would not be surprising if a few villages cropped up on either side of the artificial river within the next few years. In fact, as Ned and his troop of men trotted across the great bridge that the Isozzi had built over the canal and made their way closer to the multitude of tents, he was sure he could see a child or two running in between the canvases and various women out spreading clothes on washing lines. It seemed some of the builders had already decided to bring their families to them, unwilling to be so far from them for the period of time that such a project would require. Shouts and cries accompanied them as the civilians saw them approaching, rushing to the side of the path and waving emphatically. In rows of 4, the northern army marched past, smiling and waving at those surrounding them. First came the cavalry, led by Lords Stark, Bolton and Dustin, 5,000 men in gleaming armor atop the highest quality steeds the north had to offer, strong and large creatures with shaggy fur, bred for the harsh cold. Then came the 15,000 infantry, split into smaller groups of equal number, all led by one of the other lords. It took a whole hour to get the entirety of the army inside the gates, and that was not even the full northern force. No, another 15,000 men led by Lords Mormont, Flint, Roswell and Marndale would be making their way via ship, making up their brand new navy. Almost a decade earlier, when Lord Stark had led his men to war for the first time, 20,000 land troops had been all that they had. Now, with the great influx of wealth that had hit the north in the past 6 years, the population of the north had practically doubled due to the exodus of families moving on to the northern lands. The workers that Prince Oberyn had petitioned on behalf of Ned had come with their families and households, and small folk had flocked from the more southern kingdoms of Westeros in the hope of work when they had learned of all the changes. It was enough that Ned could afford to leave men at home, working on his projects, while still having a large enough army to be a major player in the war. Nevertheless, he hoped it would not be a long one, just as short as Robert's rebellion, which had lasted 10 months in total, or even less. Even with men left behind to continue his plans, work productivity would of course take a hit with such a reduction in workers. Then there was also the money it would take to fund the war effort, the food that would have to be shipped in droves to feed the hungry soldiers, and the second considerable decrease in pregnancies, and increase in deaths, in a decade. No, war was never a profitable venture, at least for those fighting in it, but it was a necessity. The Iron Islands had thought to attack their lands, burn their houses, steal their hard-earned money and take their women. Now Ned would return the favor tenfold. The castle is already defensible, the landscape of course playing a large role in this, but with the small workforce left to me, I estimate another 5 years before the full fortress is complete, and another half-year at least to make it habitable, furnish it and the like. Shaking his head slightly to clear his errant thoughts, Ned turned back to Master Delorme and gave a tight smile. Another year had been added to the construction due to the war, but it was better than expected, still within his schedule. And the next project? He asked, prompting the Isozzi to shuffle the papers on the table and pulling out new blueprints. Yes, the plans are almost complete, just a few more details to add here and there, though it is mostly aesthetic and this point, gardens and the like. All the necessities have been covered and drawn up. Receiving an encouraging nod in return, the master continued. As per your specifications, it will be much smaller than Moat Cailin or even Winterfell, as simply the seat of the lord of a major house, and with enough men I estimate that we can get it done in 3 or so years. Barring, of course, an interruption such as another war. Gods be good. Ned muttered. The North had already seen enough war in one man's lifetime and he was already planning another major war within the next decade or two. He spared a prayer to the old gods for peace to grace the North during his lifetime. The docks will take less time. Master Delorme continued. As you saw with White Harbor, ships can be built quite quickly when one knows the correct techniques, and I dare say you have found one of the few men in the world who knows the best one. It was true, none had been more surprised than Lord Stark when Denton Matadorn, grandson to the great shipwright D'Arabono, who was world famous for inventing a technique to build a trading cod in a day and a war galley in 3, arrived in Winterfell with a large entourage, announcing that he was there as a favor to Prince Oberyn. Ned could have kissed the man, then ridden all the way to Dorne and kissed Oberyn too. Just another 8 years. The Lord murmured, stroking his hand across the intricate designs that lay on the table. These were the last of his major plans for the North. The rest simply consisted in helping his country grow strong and happy, swelling his kingdom's population and wealth. Once they were free of Robert the Child Slayer and the Iron Throne, even if it was a nephew of his that would sit upon it one day, the North would be equal to the 7 kingdoms, and most of the remaining work to get to that point was passive. That is the hope, yes. You have done well, Master Delorme. Truly I am grateful for all of the work you have done for me. The North is forever in your debt, and you and yours will always have a place here. Holding the man's gaze to show his gratitude, Ned received the expected response, a small smile and a dismissive wave of a hand. They had had this conversation dozens of times over the years, and the SOZ would always respond the same: he was being paid for the work he was doing, and so no debt existed, and in fact it was he who was grateful to have been given such an important and challenging project after decades of the same old requests. As always, the Northerner simply gave a wry smile. Dipping his head, Lord Stark retreated for the night, returning to the main hall on the ground floor where he had set up his sleeping pack. With completely empty rooms, the men had had no choice but to set up their packs on the ground wherever they could find space and huddle together to keep warm, but there were no complaints. It was still warmer than outside the thick castle walls, and the fortress was large enough to accommodate all 20,000 men. With the men from Moat Cailin joining the army, they would be ready to continue on the road at dawn the next day. It would take another 3 weeks at a fast pace to reach the king's army, and they were all eager to pay retribution to the Iron Rapists. The courtyard was absolutely teeming with activity. Servants ran from one door to another, cutting straight through the yard carrying clothes, crates and baskets of food. Guards milled around, hand on their swords and eyes surveying their surroundings. Lords stood to the side, drinking and laughing, or in the center sparring. A flashlight drew Ned's attention right to the middle of the space, where 3 men in golden armor and pristine white cloaks stood slightly apart, forming a triangle around a pair that were dancing around each other. One of the men was older, had grey hair and a strong build, his movements quick and precise, his own white cloak identifying him as the famed Sir Barristan. The other was larger. Much larger, with a drenched and stained tunic that bulged around his protruding belly. While incredibly strong, this second man's hammer was much slower than Barristan's sword, and as Ned dismounted from his horse, he watched as the guard managed to point his weapon straight at the larger man's throat in just a few moves, ending the bout. Rather than throwing his hammer to the ground and stomping away in a fury as Ned had come to expect after years of his own spars against the man, the loser simply threw his head back and let out a bellowing laugh that echoed throughout the courtyard, drawing all attention to him for a moment before the watchers returned to their business. Ned absently noted a young boy come and take his horse and that of his companions as he continued to watch the scene, taking a deep breath and steeling himself. Straightening his back and raising his head, he took a step towards the small group, and another, until he was confidently striding towards his target, who was still unaware of his presence and instead dumping a bucket of water over his head. Finally, it seemed someone noticed him. "Your Grace," Sir Barristan called, bringing his sparring partner's attention to him and nodding in Ned's direction. A great smile lit upon the fat king's face as he turned and saw his oldest friend for the first time in almost a decade. "Ned," he called, bounding towards the Northerner with his arms open. Plastering a smile on his face, Lord Stark simply continued on until they collided, wrapping their arms around each other in a brotherly embrace. For all the weight he had put on, Robert hadn't lost a bit of his strength, squeezing until the Northerner was sure his eyes would pop out of his head. Finally, thankfully, Robert decided to release him, holding his shoulders and taking a step back to take a proper look at his friend. "Ned, you've not changed a bit. Nor have you," he quipped back with a wry smile that he did not have to fake at all. In response, the king let out a loud laugh once more and clapped him on the shoulder. "You liar. I have mirrors, you know. I've gotten fat." I look a decade older than you. The cold does wonders for one's skin. Once again, Robert simply laughed and began shepherding Ned towards the main doors of the castle where he had been introduced to his newborn son all those years ago. As they walked, the king prattled on about the old days, about how much had changed in such a short amount of time, about how much he missed his dear foster brother. It was all Ned could do to hum along in agreement. Thankfully, Robert had always been the boisterous one and Ned the quiet one, as such the king kept talking, not expecting or allowing the northerner to respond. Finally, they arrived at what Lord Stark could only assume were the rooms set aside for the king's use during his stay in Riverrun. It was a large bedroom with intricately carved wooden furnishings and silk sheets on the bed, colorful tapestries and paintings adorning the walls. A large desk sat near the window and where one would expect it to be full of papers, quills and ink pots, instead it seemed almost the entire surface of it was covered in trays of steaming and sweet-smelling food, 2 pitchers of some beverage, alcoholic most likely, and 2 cups. To the other side of the room was another door, that likely led to a private washroom or a twin bedroom for any family members. Robert did not even pause his stride as he entered, leaving Ned to slow his pace and hover by the door as he made his way straight to the desk and began pouring them both a cup of what seemed to be arbor gold. "Here you go, Ned," he said, pushing a cup to the opposite side of the desk to where he sat, indicating for the other to take a seat. The northerner approached and sat obediently, though the cup remained where it was. "Thank you, but I'll abstain from the wine for the moment." "HMMPH." Robert grunted. Lifting his own cup to his lips, he downed half of the drink before setting it back on the table with a thud. "So, you must tell me what's been going on up north. I'm sure you've heard most of it." Ned shrugged. But I want details. That canal. It's true you had Master Gillim DeLorne come all the way from Bravos to work it. And on rebuilding Moat Cailin. Moat Cailin. Robert smacked his hand on the wood, a great smile splitting his face as he regarded the northerner. "Such an ambitious man you have become, Ned. To think you hid it from me when we were boys." A mirthless smile formed on the Stark's face at those words. The king had no idea how ambitious Ned truly was. "I had no need to be ambitious," he responded. "I was but a second son at the time. Circumstances have changed and now I must take up the burden of working towards my people's future myself." The happy expression on the Stag King's face faded and he reached once more towards his cup, emptying it and refilling it before he spoke, his voice softer and more subdued than before. Well. You're still a grim bastard, at least that hasn't changed." Realizing that he had perhaps not been giving the impression of a man delighted to be reunited with his brother in all but blood, Ned's heart skipped a beat as he mentally berated himself for his stupidity. He needed Robert to believe they were still as close as they had been in their youth, even though the subterfuge went against everything that had been ingrained into him during his stay at the Eyrie with John Arryn. But he was not a Valuman. He was a northerner with different priorities. This was about vengeance, it was about justice, family and life. His plans had to go ahead for the future of his people and his family and Ned would lie, steal and cheat to ensure that it went ahead. He may have forgotten what it was to be a northerner during his 8-year stay in the south, but Lyanna's tearful pleas for forgiveness as she laid on her deathbed had enough to remind him. Starks were pack. Harm one, you harm them all. Fiercely protective and stubborn, vicious to their enemies. Northerners had long since been brutal to those that slighted them. Hiding his thoughts, Ned sighed and slumped in his chair slightly. "I'm sorry, Robert. I fear I won't be much pleasant company until the Ironborn are dealt with," he said, drawing a grim smile from the Baratheon. I heard of their attempts at Bear Island and Flint's Finger." Robert responded, fist clenched on the desk as he leaned forward, the same intensity in his eyes as he had when talking of the Targaryens. "I promise you, Ned, they will pay. We will march our troops straight to their gates and send them to their damned drowned god." Now this, war, was one thing Ned would trust Robert Baratheon with. Even as boys, Robert had always been a formidable opponent, an excellent strategist and an inspiring army leader. Sometimes Ned thought himself mad to wish war upon him one day, but he had the might of Dorne and Highgarden behind him, and none of them were slouches in the art of war either. The Tyrells had over 80,000 men to call upon and Dorne was the only nation to not be completely massacred during the Targaryen conquest other than the north. Nodding his head in thanks, Ned absently picked at the honeyed dates on the platter before him. "But you are right," Robert pronounced, a single nod accompanying the stern setting of his face. "We can catch up once this is over. For now we'll focus on giving those bastards what's theirs. Is there a plan?" At least the makings of one, but that will wait until everyone is here." "Who is missing?" Refilling his cup for the third time and downing in one go, Robert took a moment to respond. "The Storm Lords arrived just days ago and are still situating themselves, as I assume your own men are. Only Dawn is missing, but my scouts say they'll be here within the week." The Northerner was not surprised to hear the distaste in the king's tone when talking of the Dornish. Any who had fought on the Targaryen side during the rebellion was low on his list of friends, and the Tyrells only avoided outright disdain due to their willingness to bend the knee once they had been defeated. The Dornish were not given that luxury. "Actually, speaking of those snakes," Robert continued, "now that the Iron Islands have rebelled against me, I will be demanding they officially swear their oaths of fealty to me." He paused, peering intently at his friend, but Lord Stark knew what was coming next. "I will need the same from you, Ned. I know you are absolutely loyal to me, brother, but I can't be making exceptions. Even Renly and Stannis had to bend the knee, and though I know what you went through during the war, why your priority at the time was to get back to Winterfell, I'm afraid I can no longer leave the situation as is." "I know, Robert," Ned reassured the man. "I understand, and I anticipated this. It should have been done years ago, really." And the Northerner had anticipated this. He had spent the past month traveling south, running over in his head the multitude of oaths he could say and how exactly he could phrase them so as to not damn himself in the eyes of the old gods. In the north, the worst name one could earn for themselves was Oathbreaker. It was why deserters of the Night's Watch were executed with no mercy, no exception, no trial. It was why Jaime Lannister would never be welcome past the twins. It was why Ned had spent sleepless nights on their journey, trying to think of a vow that would pacify Robert and the Southerners, without jeopardizing his plans for the North. A promise uttered aloud was a vow to the gods themselves, and to break that promise was to damn yourself and any involved in the crime. If the Northerners ever had reason to accuse him of oath-breaking, he would lose his life and his family would lose their position, their wealth, their home. The days of the Starks would be over and another lord would take over as Lord Paramount of the North, likely the Boltons, considering they had attempted to declare the Starks oathbreakers and claim their place in the North a multitude of time over the last 8,000 years. Harsh, but it created a safe space where one needn't worry about knives in their back like they would in the South. After much thought, Ned was only partially satisfied with what he had come up with. With men like Tywin Lannister in attendance, subtlety would not be enough, and so he had decided to apply a time limit to his oaths. It may postpone his plans, however, seeing Robert's state after just 6 years on the throne, Ned doubted that it would delay them drastically. "Would you like my vow now, or would you prefer it in public at the same time as Prince Oberyn's?" "It would need to be public, Ned," Robert responded quietly, almost apologetically. "Not a problem, Your Grace." Lord Stark dipped his head in obedience. Rising from his seat with excuses of needing to see to the settlement of his men outside the walls of Riverrun, Ned bade his goodbyes to the king, bowing elaborately and letting out a sardonic grin when the fat man let out one of his signature bellowing laughs. Just one more week and the first steps towards making the Ironborn pay for their sins would be underway. Chapter 9. 1 week. An entire gods be damned week Ned had had to put up with Robert. Regardless of the king's previous observation that catching up may be better left until after the Ironborn had been defeated, he had spent the entire time awaiting the Dornish arrival following the Northern Lord around Riverrun. "Come. Let's spar. How is dear Catelyn? I hear she's with child again. Tell me more about your son, the one you named after me. I hear young Sansa is already a beautiful little lady. You know, I have a son just a year older than her. Come to the whorehouse with me, Ned. Come drink with me, Ned." It was enough that he almost wept when the guards up on the ramparts sounded their horns, signaling the approach of an army that could only have been the Dornish. As the last to arrive, Ned was not the only one eager to see them, and as such his hurried walk, or dignified jog according to some, away from the king garnered no gasps or stares and caused no offense to the man that was similarly rushing to get into position to greet the hated newcomers as regally as possible. "Make way for your king." he shouted, cheeks turning red as he had to push curious onlookers out of the way. "Get me my cloak. And my helm. And where the fuck is my warhammer?" If Ned didn't know better, he would think his childhood friend was trying to impress the desert lords. As it were, he simply shared an amused glance with Lord Orin as he got into position. Within minutes, the courtyard was cleared of all but the Lord Paramount of each kingdom and a few servants. King Robert in the middle, flanked by his hand John Orin and Ned, with Lord Hoster Tully on Ned's other side and Mace Tyrell after him, and Lord Tywine beside John. The only one missing was Stannis Baratheon, who despite not being the Lord of the Stormlands, Robert having passed that title on to his youngest brother much to the confusion of the realm, had been chosen to lead the Stormlander army. After arriving a few days before the northern party and ensuring his men were settled and duties were assigned, the man had ridden off with a small host of men towards the nearest coast, where he would meet the Royal and Red Wine fleets. The castle doors opened and a score of men riding their horses at a fast pace up the beaten road became visible, Prince Oberyn at the head of them. It did not take long for them to barrel through the gates, pulling on the reins of their horses to stop their advance. Almost 20 men, all carrying spears at their back and swords at their hip, wearing leather doublets that matched the color of their skin, covered by furs that Ned was sure came from Bear Island. As soon as they hopped off their steeds, servants hurried from the sides of the courtyard to gather them and lead them to the stables to rest with the other lords' horses, the Dornishmen not even turning their attention towards them as they strode purposefully towards Ned and his group. Faces all remained serious and set in stone as the men stopped a dozen or so paces away, leaving Prince Oberyn to approach alone, no one moving or speaking as he finally stopped before the king. He stood there for an unbearable 10 seconds that had Ned's heart beating faster before finally taking a knee, though not before shooting a smirk at the northerner. Bowing his head, the prince intoned loudly, "Your Grace, King Robert. As you know, my eldest sibling," a slight phrasing of words that reminded them all of his other sibling, and consequently her brutal death, is currently debilitated by his illness and is unable to leave Sunspear. As such, he sends me to speak and fight on his behalf. Robert grunted in acknowledgement of the man's words but did not signal him to rise. "To speak on his behalf, you say?" "Yes, Your Grace." The Dornish prince shifted slightly, and a slight tightening of his jaw that Ned was sure he only noticed because of his time spent with the man indicated how the situation grated on him. "Considering the recent rebellion of the Ironborn, my brother thought it high time we swore our oaths to you as our king." The lords all made sounds of surprise or pleasure, Lord Tywine drawing himself taller with a smug look upon his face, as if he had won a great victory. Considering the entire realm knew it had been he who had ordered his dogs to attack the princess and her children during the sack of King's Landing, Ned imagined hearing that his greatest threat was to swear loyalty to his son-in-law would indeed please the man immeasurably. A slight flick of Robert's fingers had Prince Oberyn rising, a pleasant, if somewhat patronizing, Ned thought, smile on his face and all trace of discomfort or displeasure gone. "A ceremony shall be held this evening in Riverrun's Great Hall to allow you and Lord Stark to pledge your vows of fealty," Robert stated, his tone firm though the lines on his face has softened slightly. Oberyn nodded and the line disbanded, Lords Arryn, Tully and Lannister giving short bows to the king before returning to the castle to tend to their affairs. Ned, Mace Tyrell and Prince Oberyn gravitated towards each other, this being the first time they saw each other since their meeting at Highgarden at the beginning of winter, and of course, Robert was not about to go anywhere else without his best friend. Oberyn shot the northerner a look seeing the king's proximity and he struggled to keep himself from sighing and rolling his eyes. "You have no idea what I've had to put up with while waiting for you," Ned tried to convey. Considering the prince's expression turn from annoyed to amused, Lord Stark was fairly sure he got his point across. "I trust winter has not touched Dawn too terribly, Prince Oberyn?" Lord Tyrell asked with only a slight hint of polite curiosity in his voice. Clearly the man was not as oafish as his mother often complained and was downplaying his relationship to the other two in the alliance. In fact, Ned realized that in the past week that they had been in the same castle, they had only ever exchanged a few polite words of small talk rather than resuming some of the interesting conversations they had been having via Raven. Though Robert's presence really made serious discussions and debates quite difficult to have regardless of who it was with. "It has not, Lord Tyrell, thank you for asking," Oberyn responded, bowing his head slightly. "Of course, the weather became more temperate and we had to rely on our southernmost fields for the farming of some of our luxury items. Really no different than any other winter we have been through. I must say though, these northern furs really are top quality, Lord Stark. I imagine they bring you much coin. Watching Robert's head swivel from one person to another was almost comical as the trio engaged in inconsequential prattle, something he never imagined Eddard Stark of all people participating in. One could almost taste the man's confusion as they continued their talk, practically ignoring the 6'4" bear of a man with a gleaming golden crown. Through tax, perhaps. Ned responded, sparing a small smile for the Dornishman much to Robert's shock. The furs you and your men are wearing are from Bear Island, I believe. Only Mormont men can produce cloaks of that quality. Is that so? Mace asked, tilting his head to the side. I wonder why that is. Well, though the North is quite a wild and primal place in general, Bear Island is known to be an absolute hub for wildlife. I'm uncertain what it is, but the location is simply perfect for the animals there to thrive, particularly bears, as the streams and rivers are absolutely overflowing with salmon. Anyway, their fur is much thicker and healthier than any you can find on the mainland. Additionally, those that live on the island are trained from a young age to fight off large predators, and often become the best hunters in the entirety of the North. I do believe you mentioned Lord Mormont gifted 2 cloaks of bear fur to Jon and Robb during their first Name-a-Day celebration. Oberyn commented. Jon and Robb's, the king said, his brows furrowing. I thought the first Name-a-Day celebration was only for the heir. Ned nodded, turning slightly as he noticed that the 3 of them had formed a triangle and left Robert standing slightly outside of the boundary. That's right, traditionally that is the case, but considering how close in age the boys are and that Jon is the son of a firstborn, bastard or not, I thought it ideal to celebrate both of them. It seemed Robert's frown softened slightly as he stepped forward into the newly formed square of men, and Ned's heart unclenched somewhat. Only to completely stop beating at Oberyn's next words. How is little Jon, anyway, Lord Stark? Whipping his head back from the king to the Dornishman, he tried his best to keep his eyes from widening at the question. Was the man mad? Jon Snow? Robert asked, his frown returned with a vengeance. How do you know Ned's nephew? Jon was born in Dorne, didn't you know? Oberyn replied, a hint of a smirk on his face. It seemed even Mace realized they were stepping into dangerous territory as he cleared his throat and shuffled his feet slightly, sending the northerner a worried glance. Ned, however, was preoccupied by Robert's sudden questioning look as heat spread throughout his body, and he hoped his face was not reddening. Dorne. Yes, Robert. The northerner responded, trying to convey with his tone that surely he had mentioned this to his friend before. No. He was handed to me by a villager near Starfall after I had returned Arthur Dayne's sword to his family. Lifting his chin as if to convey a silent "oh," Robert paused a moment before resuming his interrogation. But when did he meet Prince Oberyn? An idea blossoming, Ned suddenly shifted his demeanor, standing taller and pursing his lips as if in disapproval. I went to present my condolences to the Martells once my duties to House Dayne were complete. They met him there. And that was that. Oberyn's eyes flashed in anger at the mention of his sister, and Robert, in a rare moment of thoughtfulness, immediately backed off and let the subject go. As foul as his mood was, Ned almost backhanded Mace when he heard a small sigh of relief escape his lips. Well, he said instead, his tone still closed off and his face set in a stern expression. I need to check on my men before the feast tonight, and I assume Prince Oberyn needs to get settled in, so I will leave you now. Barely bowing his head in respect to his king, the northerner immediately turned and headed towards the stables to fetch his horse, and before long he was out the gates and riding along the path that would lead him to his army's camp. Sighing, he realized that he would have to agree to every one of Robert's requests to spar and drink to get him forget that little episode, and he cursed Oberyn Martell and his arrogant mouth. The next morning saw the Lords Paramount of the Seven Kingdoms, barring of course Lords Balon Greyjoy and Stannis Baratheon, gathered in the main solar of the castle, on one of its highest floors. It was a ramshackle group of men, and in fact only Tywin Lannister and Ned seemed their usual selves, having only had a few glasses of wine at the feast the night previous. Everyone else was slumped in their chair, pale and squinting at the light of the sun through the window. There wasn't much Eddard Stark and Tywin Lannister agreed on, but in this instance they both stood at their places around the desk, lips pursed and stances rigid as they looked upon the others with disapproval, a perfect mirror of each other. Turning up to a war council hungover, What an idea. That said, Ned was still in a better mood than he had been for a while, having a weight that had burdened him for over a month finally removed from his shoulders. As promised, both Oberyn and he had sworn their vows of fealty to King Robert before the feast, in front of hundreds of witnesses. I, Eddard of House Stark, Lord Paramount of the North, do swear before the gods old and new my loyalty to King Robert Baratheon, first of his name, King of the Andals and the First Men, Protector of the Seven Kingdoms, and accept the privileges and duties that come with. Simple and to the point, as everyone had come to expect of the quiet wolf of the North, no words wasted. What everyone failed to notice is that firstly, he had only pledged himself, not the North, and that secondly, his vow had only been to Robert, not any of his descendants. He was not about to offer his fealty in perpetuity as his ancestor had done for the Targaryens. Actually, he had been quite surprised that Oberyn's oath had been quite similar, though with more flourishes and additions. He had only promised fealty to Robert himself, though he did include the entirety of Dorne in his vow. Regardless, that was over with and Robert was appeased. And hung over, staring blankly at a map of Westeros. "If you would like us to begin, Your Grace?" Tywin asked, though his tone held more steel than was necessary for a request of his king. Robert barely noticed, instead jerking to attention. "Eh? Oh right. Yes. He stood, pushing up with his arms to help him out of his seat and huffing at the effort before coming to lean against the table and the maps that lay upon it, the other lords following suit. "So?" The king cleared his throat and scrunched his face, as if to clear some of the numbness. "The Ironborn have already attacked Lannisport, Old Town, Flint's Finger and Bear Island," he said, pointing at each location on the map as he said them. "Not a single Riverland town has yet been touched, despite it being a fairly rich and poorly defended area. It is the closest of the kingdoms to the Iron Islands and the rivers allow easy access far enough inland to take the whole damn territory." Lord Tully huffed, but even he could not deny Robert's words. The Riverlands had never been an easily defensible land and as such had played host to a multitude of battles throughout history, the Battle of the Trident during Robert's Rebellion and the Field of Fire during the Conquest being the two most prominent ones. "Seaguard is a strong port within easy reach of the rest of our coasts," he argued nevertheless. "Aye," Robert agreed, eyes moving to the point on the map. "That is why Greyjoy will aim to cripple Seaguard before moving on to the rest of the Riverlands." There was a moment of pensive silence as the lords pondered on that, eyes tracing the map, searching for weak points and tracing easy routes from the Iron Islands. With Seaguard comes the Riverlands, and with the Riverlands taken, the Seven Kingdoms will be split in two. The North on one side of the enemy and the rest of us on the other. Prince Oberyn commented. "And with the Northern Army down south with us, that leaves it open for invasion once the Ironborn have a hold on the mainland." Ned doubted the North was in any real danger, with the neck to traverse and then Moat Cailin to get past, however incomplete it was, not to mention that the Northern fleet could cut them off at the canal with barely any notice. Any invasion from the south was doomed. Yet the risk was still too great, and regardless of victory or failure, Northern civilians would die in an attempted invasion. "Stannis is already positioned in Iron Man's Bay with the Royal and Red Wine fleets, ready to defend it when the Iron Fuckers attack. And they will attack," Robert stated, turning his attention to them all one by one. "Agreed. And the Northern fleet is awaiting its orders on the northern side of the Cape of Eagles," Ned added, eliciting nods of acknowledgement from the others. "We need to split our forces among the fleets, Royal to guard Seaguard and the Riverlands, Red Wine to remain on standby and ready to take chase if the Ironborn head elsewhere, and the North ready to attack the islands themselves, to be joined by the others during the last leg. Lords Baratheon, Stark and Tyrell already have their posts then, all that is left is to assign placements to the rest of the troops." Lord Tywin commented, drawing nods from the others. "With the Tyrell numbers they do not need much more reinforcements. I propose Prince Oberyn join them with his 15,000 spearmen." If Ned hadn't already had words with the Dornishman about his behavior, he was sure the hot-headed prince would have responded with something scathing. Or perhaps just drawn his dagger at the lion's audacity. As it was, he simply narrowed his eyes and clenched his jaw, nodding once in agreement yet refusing to deign the Lannister with actual words. "Good," Robert continued, his energy slowly coming back as the meeting went on. Or perhaps it was his familiarization with hangovers that had him recovering quickly. The Crown Land forces will join the Starks on the frontal assault, and the Riverlands will join my brother and the Stormlander forces at Seaguard. Would the Crown Lands not be with the Royal Fleet? Mace Tyrell asked confusedly, echoing the thoughts of those around the table. No. Stannis will head the Royal Fleet, and with him comes the Stormlands. Lord Stark and I have fought together before and know each other's strengths and weaknesses. I fight with him. Robert responded firmly. It was true, they had grown up together, learnt to spar together, and then fought a rebellion side by side. If there was one man that Ned knew he could lead an army with, it was Robert, despite his hatred against him. It was bizarre having such contrary opinions. Goes without saying, the Crown Lands army goes where I do. Very well, Your Grace. Tywine nodded. With 60,000 men on the Red Wine Fleet, 50,000 on the Royal Fleet and another 60,000 on the Northern Fleet, where shall Lord Arryn and I send out men? Ned let out a shocked breath at the numbers. With all the armies of the Seven Kingdoms united against a common goal, their force was impressive. Enough so that he wasn't sure there would even be room for them on the ships, as against the Ironborn, naval battles were sure to be the only fights there would be, rather than two armies comprising of archers, infantrymen and a cavalry facing off on opposing sides of a field. Perhaps it was arrogance that had made the Northern Lord muster up a total army of 35,000. Eagerness at showing the Southerners that the North was no longer the weakest of them. He could have left the entirety of the host he had marched down with up north, left them at home and simply joined up with the 15,000-strong navy he had built. The Red Wine Fleet is over 300 ships strong, Your Grace. Considering we are unsure of the Ironborn's next moves nor the number of their ships, perhaps it would be best to station Lords Lannister and Arryn on that fleet. After all, if the Ironborn head for multiple targets, they may need to split their forces. Aye, not a bad idea. Very well, Your Grace. The two remaining lords nodded, accepting their positions. Good. Now, we will head to our stations as soon as our men are ready to move. It will take a week to reach Seaguard, and another 2 or 3 days for Ned and I to reach the other side of the Cape Eagles. We remain on standby for 1 more week before the Northern Fleet heads for the attack, taking Blacktide and Oakmont before moving west. The Royal Fleet will take Harlaw and join us when reaching Pike. The Red Wine Fleet, your main objective is destroying any Ironborn ship that leaves the safety of their islands, but if you are left available to attack, then you come from the west, taking Great Wyk. Hopefully this shitfest will be over in less than 2 months. That was music to their ears. They all had families waiting at home, they all had other duties to attend to, none of them wished to waste time, and so the Greyjoys would be put down hard, and Ned would hopefully be home in time to see his next child born. Chapter 10. Hello again everyone. I know it has been a while since I last posted, and I'm sorry about that. I've found that I write what I read, and unfortunately, Game of Thrones fics aren't all that common, and I read all the ones that interest me ages ago, so I've now moved on to reading from different fandoms. This story is still very much in progress, and I will not be abandoning it even if I occasionally lose inspiration. Thank you for sticking with me so far. I also have to thank you all for your follows, favorites and reviews. I have never gotten so many responses and I'm in absolute awe. I never imagined anything I wrote would be so popular, and I have to admit the pressure is really being felt, lol. Anyway, here is the next chapter. We take a little break from Ned and the war to see what's going on at home, but not to worry. We'll soon be getting back to the main events. Love you all. Don't forget to review. My dearest Caitlin. I'm afraid I may not be as prepared for this war as I first thought. Or perhaps over-prepared. It seems in my haste to pay retribution to the Ironborn for their attacks on our people, I neglected to think of the other armies that would be part of this war. We are 8 powerful kingdoms going against a single adversary, one not known for its abundant army at that, and yet we have each brought thousands of men with us to war. We stand at 215,000 men against the Iron Islands' 20,000. Perhaps a little excessive, I would say. What is worse, we have all, with the exception of the Lannisters, brought cavalry to attack a cluster of islands made of rocks and jagged cliffs, which we can only access via ship. I look back now and curse my eagerness. We leave Riverrun in a few hours. I write this just as the sunlight peeks over the horizon, and head for the coast. We have decided to split our forces, and I head for the Northern Fleet with King Robert and the Crown Lands Army, ready for a direct assault. With our overabundance of men and ships, I believe this war will be quickly over, with few casualties on our side. I hope to be with you soon, in time to see our child be born. Do you think it will be a boy or a girl? I must admit, as long as I am there with you and there are no complications, I care not one bit. The king has ordered a tourney at land support once the Ironborn have been defeated, however. I can only hope that it will not last too long, though I believe that is a fool's wish. I fear I will not reach you in time. If this is the case, please believe that I am thinking of you and our babe every waking hour. Winter is over in the south, and the first stirrings of summer have made themselves known, another area where I seem to have taken leave of my wits. I have packed far too many furs, forgetting that winter in the south ends before it does in the north. I expect it will reach the north by the end of the year. It cannot come too soon, as even with our increased wealth I fear for our people after years of knowing only death and starvation during these colder years. I envy the south for their short summers, but I know the north must be thriving under your and Benjen's direction, despite all the men I have deprived you of. I know that you both can handle the distribution of food as you have assisted me for these past few years. Yet I still worry. How are you and the babe? I hope you are not overexerting yourself. How are the children? Are John and Rob making time for little Sangza? I have been gone not even 2 months and yet I feel as though I am missing so much. I want to ask how much they've grown and if Sangza still likes oranges and if John and Rob still sneak into each other's rooms at night, but of course I know the answer. Nothing can change that quickly, can it? I must be going now, my love. Fear not for me and our countrymen, we shall return home safely. As soon as I can manage it. Crumpling the letter to her chest as she leant her head against the window, Caitlin replayed its words in her mind. She had read the thing so many times now that she knew it by heart. His love for her and their children, and nephew, but they had both always treated John like one of their own and the distinction barely mattered anymore, was warming. It still made her flush and giggle like a maiden after 6 years of marriage. It was funny, Caitlin thought. Growing up as a lady of Riverrun, she had heard countless stories of the north. Travelers told of an unwelcoming land, vast yet empty, with summers that were barely as warm as the winters she had grown used to as a child and a brusque people who preferred to fight and hunt more than singing or wearing finery. Septars told of unsophisticated people who, because of their spurning the light of the real gods, were uncultured, unintelligent, barbaric. They mated with animals, they ate their enemies, they danced naked in the forests. It was enough to terrify little Caitlin Tully, and though she had stood tall and graciously accepted her betrothal to Brandon Stark when her father had announced it, she had cried for weeks in the privacy of her rooms. And then she had met Brandon at the tourney of Harrenhal. He was definitely brusque, preferred to say things straight rather than mix his words with false flattery or really any type of speech that would make him come across as softer and more refined. And he surely had a wild temper, gladly getting into fights when someone inevitably took offense to his frank honesty. But he was sophisticated. He was well read, he wore fine furs and leathers and expensive boots, he was shaven and told interesting stories. Suddenly, the prospect of marrying him hadn't seemed so bad. And then he had died and she had been passed off to his brother, a quiet and shy boy of an age with her from what she had seen at the tourney. The north itself was very much like the travelers had told her. Cold, unwelcoming and empty, and yet its people were warm. Over time, she came to appreciate the ladies that laughed loudly and openly, rather than hiding their small giggles behind their hands like she had been taught to do at home, the cheery welcomes she got with lords grabbing her shoulders and kissing her cheeks to say hello. The first time Lord Umber had done that, she had slapped him across the face. She had almost burst into tears at the realization of what she had done and was about to fall to her knees to ask for her Lord Stark's forgiveness for disrespecting his bannerman when Umber had laughed. And laughed, harder and longer than she had ever seen anyone. When he finally stopped, he had clapped her on the back and said they'd make a northerner of her yet. Yes, she thought. They were definitely a people accustomed to a harsh life. No time for pleasantries, no need for fineries. Needs came before pleasure, everyone knew that. It was so different from her life in Riverrun that she felt almost like an alien. But she was a lady of the South and she had been raised her whole life to mold herself into what her lord husband desired, and so she did. It was bizarre. Ned had wanted her, despite them being a marriage of convenience. He had not wanted her to be pretty, or quiet, or obedient like she had been prepared to make herself be, he had just wanted a wife. And so she had had to learn to mold herself into herself. The only thing he did ask was for her to learn the Northern way and for her to become a part of their culture, if she could stomach it. As much as she had been infatuated with Brandon when they had met, she loved Ned with all her heart. She was right in a way, at first. Ned was everything his brother was not, but unlike her first thoughts, that was not a bad thing. Ned was loving, caring, a good father, a good husband, a responsible lord, an honorable man. He was calm and thoughtful and pleasant to be around, whereas John's existence attested to how happy she would have been, married to Brandon. To her best guess, her nephew would have been conceived during the tourney at Harrenhal, once their betrothal had already been agreed and while he spent his days flattering her and showering her with flowers and chaste kisses. All flirtatious lies, and as much as she wished he was still alive, she was glad that she had married his brother instead. The only thing she could fault her husband for was his complete disregard and disdain for any part of Southern culture. The seven were unforgiving and